Before there was an empire, there was theft. British involvement in Africa did not begin with missionaries, governors, or flags planted in the soil. It began at sea, with small ships, loose authority, and men looking for profit wherever it could be taken. There was no grand design, no civilizing mission, only opportunity. Across 4 centuries, the methods would change. Piracy became trade. Trade became administration. Administration hardened into borders, armies, and law. But the motive did not change. Money shaped every decision. What to seize, where to settle, which people mattered, and which could be ignored. As profits shifted from gold to slaves, from land to minerals, from raw extraction to global finance, Britain's relationship with Africa shifted with it. Each new system replaced the last. Each one left scars that did not disappear when the system collapsed. By the end, Britain did not rule Africa as a single empire. It ruled fragments. Ports, corridors, mines, plantations, and strategic choke points. Together, they formed a system, connected by ships, capital, and coercion. This is not a story of destiny or inevitability. It is a story of incentives. And once you see British Africa as one connected economic machine, its rise, its violence, and its collapse begin to make sense. The next 400 years start at sea. England did not arrive in Africa as an empire. It arrived as an outsider. At the beginning of the 16th century, the global balance of power had already settled into place, and England was not part of it. Spain and Portugal had moved first, pushing outward across the Atlantic with the authority of papal decrees, naval force, and accumulated experience. They did not merely explore new routes, they claimed them. Sea lanes, ports, and trading privileges were treated as possessions, guarded by fleets, and enforced through violence. By the time England looked south, toward Africa, the Atlantic world had already been spoken for. English merchants knew this. So did English sailors. Lawful trade, as defined by Europe's dominant powers, was closed to them. Portugal controlled the African coastline through a chain of forts and trading posts, regulating access to gold, ivory, spices, and increasingly, enslaved people. Spain, focused on the Americas, depended on this system and helped defend it. Together, they created an Atlantic order designed to exclude late arrivals. England was late, and England was weak. Without colonies, without fortified ports, and without the naval strength to challenge Iberian dominance directly, England turned toward the margins. Africa, at this moment, was not a unified zone of imperial control. Authority along the coast was fragmented. Local rulers governed ports and river mouths. Trade networks existed, but they were negotiated, unstable, and constantly contested. This fragmentation mattered. Where control was incomplete, opportunity existed. Early English contact with Africa did not follow treaties or charters. It followed the logic of intrusion. Ships appeared suddenly along the coast. They traded when conditions allowed. They stole when they did not. The distinction between commerce and violence was thin, often irrelevant. This was a period before piracy had been fully criminalized. Raiding could be denied. Responsibility could be blurred. States benefited while maintaining distance. England did not yet think in terms of territory. It thought in terms of cargo. Gold that could be taken. Goods that could be resold. Human beings who could be moved across oceans and exchanged for profit elsewhere. This mindset shaped every early decision. English ships hugged the African coast, relying on stolen charts, captured pilots, and knowledge extracted from Portuguese crews. Mapping itself became an act of appropriation. Coastlines were filled in carefully. River mouths were marked. Safe anchorages were noted. The interior remained largely unknown because it was not yet necessary. African rulers encountered the English with caution. They had long experience with foreign traders and understood the risks involved. Some alliances formed, based on mutual advantage and short-term calculation. Others collapsed into conflict. English ships were attacked. Crews were killed. Agreements dissolved as quickly as they were made. English accounts framed resistance as betrayal. African perspectives saw unpredictability and danger. Both were accurate. The English lacked consistency. They could not enforce long-term obligations. They could not guarantee protection. This made them unreliable partners, but also useful alternatives where Portuguese control was too rigid. Out of this unstable world emerged figures like John Hawkins. Hawkins did not invent England's involvement in Africa, but he gave it structure. In the 1560s, he organized voyages that linked African coasts, American plantations, and English ports into a single circuit of profit. Captives were acquired through negotiation, coercion, and violence. then sold illegally in Spanish colonies, where labor shortages overrode imperial law. Silver and goods flowed back to England. The profits were significant, but the lesson mattered more. England did not need permission to profit from the Atlantic system. It needed access, and access could be taken. By the beginning of the 17th century, England had learned something essential. Piracy could open doors, but it could not keep them open. Raids produced sudden profit, but they produced instability just as quickly. Ships came and went. Captains died. Alliances collapsed. Money disappeared as fast as it was made. For merchants who wanted predictable returns, the margins were no longer enough. Permanent profit required permanence. The English presence along the African coast began to change its character. The sea was still central, but ships alone were no longer sufficient. What England needed was not conquest, but footholds. Places where trade could be stored, protected, and regulated. Places that could survive the absence of a fleet. Places made of stone. Forts began to replace ships as the backbone of English involvement in Africa. This shift did not happen because England suddenly became strong. It happened because England remained weak. It could not afford large armies. It could not conquer inland territories. It could not displace African political authority without provoking resistance. It could not control, but it could build small, defensible structures on the coast and use them to anchor trade. These forts were not capitals. They were not settlements in the European sense. They were tools. Built at river mouths, natural harbors, and narrow coastal corridors. English forts were designed to control movement rather than land. They faced the sea. Their cannons pointed outward. Their walls were meant to protect warehouses, not populations. Everything about their design reflected a single priority. Trade must continue, even when ships were absent. This was not colonial rule. It was logistical control. The English made this distinction carefully. Forts were described as factories or trading posts, not colonies. Their purpose was extraction, not governance. They did not seek to administer African societies. They sought to sit beside them, extract value, and withdraw profit. African sovereignty was not erased by these structures. It was negotiated. Land on which forts were built was rarely seized outright. Instead, it was leased, rented, paid for through tribute or annual gifts. Local rulers retained authority over surrounding territory. English officials understood their position clearly. They were guests with cannons, tolerated as long as they remained useful. This arrangement was fragile and deliberate. By recognizing African sovereignty, the English avoided the cost of conquest. They also avoided responsibility for inland security, food supply, and political stability. Forts were islands of European presence surrounded by African power. Their survival depended on cooperation as much as force. The labor that built these forts was overwhelmingly African. Stone was quarried locally. Timber was cut nearby. Skilled and unskilled laborers were recruited, coerced, or contracted through African authorities. European overseers directed construction, but they did not provide manpower. They could not. Too few survived long enough. Disease shaped everything. The African coast was deadly to Europeans. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and other illnesses killed newcomers at staggering rates. Mortality among European crews stationed ashore was constant. Many forts replaced their personnel every few years. Some every few months. The stone remained. The men did not. This reality reinforced English strategy. Large settlements were impossible. Inland expansion was suicidal. Concentration increased death. Minimal presence increased survival. Forts were designed to house as few Europeans as possible, for as short a time as possible. Africa was not resisting empire at this stage. It was resisting biology. Inside the forts, trade was formalized. Goods arrived by ship and were stored securely. Gold dust, ivory, pepper, cloth, weapons. Over time, captives became the most valuable cargo of all. The Atlantic slave trade was expanding rapidly, and forts became holding points within that system. Captives were not usually taken by English soldiers. They were acquired through African intermediaries, wars, raids, and judicial systems that predated European arrival. The English did not need to organize violence inland. They needed to be ready when captives arrived at the coast. Forts served that function. Within their walls, human beings were confined, counted, branded, and prepared for shipment. The fort faced the sea, but its most important rooms faced inward. Dungeons, courtyards, holding cells. These spaces were not designed for long-term confinement. They were designed for turnover. Time mattered. Disease spread quickly. Death reduced profit. The English did not invent this system. Portuguese forts had done the same. But the English expanded it with discipline and scale. They standardized procedures. They regulated exchange. They recorded transactions carefully. Paper followed profit. Trade posts became nodes in a growing network. Each fort was linked to others by sea routes, schedules, and contracts. Ships arrived expecting cargo. Delays were costly. Failure was punished. The fort was expected to deliver. African rulers understood this pressure. They negotiated accordingly. Prices shifted. Demands increased. Alliances hardened or collapsed based on supply and payment. Power flowed not from flags, but from leverage. The English presence altered coastal politics. Access to European goods changed local hierarchies. Control over trade routes became more valuable than land itself. Rulers who could deliver captives or commodities gained advantage over rivals. Those who resisted found themselves bypassed. Still, English authority did not extend far beyond the walls. Outside the fort, African law applied. English traders who offended local customs risked retaliation. Agreements were fragile and required constant renewal through gifts, payments, and diplomacy. The English learned to speak cautiously, to defer publicly, to threaten privately. Violence remained close, but it was contained. The fort allowed England to stabilize profit without stabilizing rule. It separated commerce from conquest. This separation was not moral, it was practical. By the mid-17th century, English forts dotted key points along the West African coast. None were large, none were sufficient. All depended on African labor, African politics, and African tolerance. England did not rule these regions. It occupied narrow points within them. This distinction mattered deeply, because by controlling trade points rather than territory, England avoided costs that crippled other empires. It did not need to govern populations. It did not need to feed armies. It did not need to suppress revolts inland. Its exposure remained limited. Its profits did not. But this system also created dependence. Forts could not survive without African cooperation. Disease ensured that Europeans would always be a minority. Supplies came from local markets. Security depended on negotiated peace. English power was real, but conditional. This balance produced tension. Merchants wanted expansion. Governors wanted security. African rulers wanted higher prices and greater autonomy. Each side tested limits constantly. Skirmishes erupted, forts were attacked. Some were abandoned. Others were rebuilt stronger. Stone replaced wood. Cannons grew heavier. Walls thickened. Not because England intended to conquer Africa, but because trade demanded protection. By the end of the 17th century, piracy had not disappeared. It had been absorbed. Violence still existed, but it was now anchored, predictable, accounted for. Forts transformed improvisation into infrastructure. Britain was still not an empire in Africa. It did not govern territory. It did not administer populations. It controlled movement, exchange, access. This system worked. But it carried a cost. Permanent structures create permanent interests. Forts demanded defense. Defense demanded authority. Authority invited resistance. And resistance, eventually, would force a choice Britain had avoided for generations. The balance they found would not last. The next chapter begins, when trade hardens into ownership and control, reaches beyond the walls. By the middle of the 17th century, England's involvement in Africa had outgrown improvisation. Ships and forts had proven that profit was possible. Repetition had proven that it could be sustained. What remained uncertain was control. Private merchants competed with one another. Smugglers undermined prices. Violence flared unpredictably. For the English state, this disorder was no longer tolerable. Too much money was at stake. The solution was organization. In 1660, the English monarchy was restored under Charles II. The crown returned not only to power, but to debt. War, exile, and political instability had emptied royal finances. The Atlantic offered relief. Africa offered leverage. What was required was a structure that could turn risk into revenue and chaos into accounting. The Royal African Company was that structure. Granted a royal charter in 1663 and expanded in 1672, the company was given monopoly rights over English trade along the West African coast. No English subject was legally permitted to trade in gold, ivory, or enslaved people without its approval. The Atlantic margins that England had once exploited informally were now claimed by law. This was not simply a business, it was a state-backed system. The company's leadership overlapped directly with England's political elite. Members of the royal family held shares. Senior politicians invested heavily. Naval officers protected company ships. Parliament debated its interests. Profit and governance merged until they were difficult to separate. Slavery, within this framework, ceased to be opportunistic. It became organized. The Royal African Company did not invent the Atlantic slave trade. It standardized it. Forts were expanded and fortified. Trade routes were scheduled. Contracts were enforced. Captives were no longer just cargo. They were inventory. Human beings were counted, listed, valued, insured. Branding irons marked bodies to signify ownership, reducing identity to proof of transaction. Ledgers recorded age, sex, condition, and origin. Losses were calculated. Death became an expected expense rather than a moral disruption. Profit margins absorbed suffering without acknowledgement. This was bureaucracy at work. African forts became administrative centers rather than improvisational outposts. Warehouses stored trade goods systematically. Holding cells were organized by shipment. Ships arrived expecting exact numbers. Delays were penalized. Efficiency mattered. The company did not seek to conquer African territory. It did not need to. Its monopoly depended on control of exchange, not land. African sovereignty was still formally recognized. Rent was paid. Tribute continued. Local rulers remained essential partners in supply. But the balance had shifted. Where earlier English traders negotiated as outsiders, company agents negotiated as representatives of a state-backed monopoly. Prices were fixed more aggressively. Demands increased. Refusal carried consequences. Naval retaliation became more common. Fort cannons spoke more often. African rulers adapted. Some consolidated power by controlling supply routes. Others resisted, redirecting trade to rivals or encouraging smuggling. Violence increased not because Africans were newly hostile, but because pressure had intensified. Slavery expanded accordingly. Captives moved through the system with increasing speed. Inland conflicts fed coastal demand. Judicial enslavement intensified. Raiding expanded. The company did not organize these processes, but it rewarded them. Demand shaped behavior far beyond the shoreline. In England, the Royal African Company transformed political culture. Investment in slavery became respectable. Shares were traded. Dividends distributed. Slavery entered polite society as finance, rather than violence. Members of Parliament defended the company's monopoly, not on moral grounds, but economic ones. Competition, they argued, would destabilize trade. Smuggling would reduce revenue. Order required exclusivity. But exclusivity bred resistance. Independent merchants resented the monopoly. Colonial planters in the Americas demanded more captives at lower prices. Smugglers ignored the law and traded illegally along the coast. The Atlantic was too large to police. Completely, conflict followed. The company lobbied aggressively for enforcement. Naval patrols increased. Courts prosecuted smugglers. But enforcement was inconsistent. Corruption spread. Officials accepted bribes. Company agents participated in illegal trade themselves. The monopoly weakened from within. Meanwhile, the costs of maintaining forts, fleets, and personnel mounted. Disease continued to kill European staff. Wars with rival European powers disrupted shipping. Insurance claims rose. Profit margins narrowed. Slavery was still lucrative. But it was no longer neat. By the late 17th century, criticism of the Royal African Company intensified. Not because of slavery itself, but because of inefficiency. Merchants argued that open competition would increase supply and lower prices. The state began to listen. In 1698, Parliament effectively ended the company's monopoly, opening African trade to all English merchants willing to pay a fee. The Royal African Company did not disappear overnight, but its authority collapsed. Slavery did not end. It expanded. The system the company had built proved stronger than the institution itself. What remained was structure. Forts stayed in place. Ledgers remained. Accounting practices persisted. Human beings continued to be reduced to units of exchange. The bureaucracy of slavery survived the collapse of monopoly, intact. This mattered, because once slavery became administrative, it no longer depended on individual cruelty or exceptional violence. It functioned through routine, through paperwork, through distance. Responsibility fragmented. No single actor felt accountable. Everyone played a role. No one claimed ownership of the outcome. Britain had not conquered Africa, but it had embedded itself deeply within its economies. It had transformed human extraction into a regulated system backed by state power and financial logic. Slavery had become normal. This system carried enormous profit. It also carried instability. Competition intensified. Supply chains stretched. Resistance grew on all sides of the Atlantic. The order the Royal African Company created could not hold indefinitely. The next chapter begins when open competition replaces monopoly and slavery, accelerates beyond anyone's control. By the beginning of the 18th century, Britain's relationship with Africa had ceased to be experimental. It had become structural. The forts still stood along the coast. Ships still came and went. African rulers still negotiated terms. But the logic driving the system had expanded far beyond the shoreline. Africa was no longer simply a place of extraction. It had been locked into a global machine. This machine did not operate in Africa alone. It operated across oceans, ports, plantations, counting houses, and banks. Its movement formed a triangle, but its power came from connection. Each leg depended on the others. Each failure reverberated through the whole. British manufactured goods left ports in England. They crossed the Atlantic and followed the African coast. Textiles, metalware, guns, gunpowder, alcohol, beads, and tools filled the holds. These goods were not chosen for usefulness. They were chosen for exchange value. What mattered was not what they did, but what they could buy. Along the African coast, these goods were converted into captives. Human beings moved through forts that had already been optimized for speed and control. Transactions were recorded. Numbers were confirmed. Ships were loaded to capacity. Once full, they turned west. The Middle Passage followed. Captives were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas and Caribbean. There, they were sold into plantation systems producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and later coffee. These crops were not consumed locally. They were exported back to Europe. Ships returned to Britain, heavy with raw materials. The triangle closed, and then it repeated. This was not a loose pattern. It was a system of interdependence. British ports depended on African supply. Plantations depended on African labor. Factories depended on plantation output. Banks depended on all of it moving on schedule. Africa was not peripheral to this system. It was foundational. In Britain, specific cities became engines of this trade. Liverpool, Bristol, and London expanded rapidly, not because they produced goods of exceptional quality, but because they specialized in movement. They organized shipping. They financed voyages. They ensured risk. Liverpool, in particular, transformed itself around the trade. Its docks multiplied. Warehouses expanded. Shipyards grew busier each decade. Families accumulated wealth not through production, but through circulation. Money was made by ensuring that ships left full and returned heavier. Bristol followed a similar path, though earlier London dominated finance, insurance, and policy. Together, these cities formed the British end of the triangle. Their growth was visible. New buildings rose. Streets widened. Cultural institutions flourished. Wealth expressed itself in stone, art, and influence. The source of that wealth was distant and abstracted. Banking systems evolved to manage the scale of the trade. Voyages required large upfront investment. Ships, crews, cargo, and fort maintenance demanded capital long before profit was realized. Credit filled the gap. Loans were extended. Interest accrued. Insurance emerged as a necessity, not a luxury. Ships could sink. Captives could die. Markets could collapse. Insurance companies learned to price human loss mathematically. Mortality rates became variables. Death was not denied. It was calculated. This calculation mattered. Once loss could be predicted, it could be absorbed. Once it could be absorbed, it no longer threatened the system. Slavery became resilient because it was no longer fragile. Profit math replaced moral judgment. A certain percentage of captives were expected to die during transport. This was not considered failure. It was considered overhead. As long as returns exceeded losses, the voyage was successful. This logic did not require cruelty. It permitted it. African societies felt the pressure of this demand acutely. The scale of extraction increased dramatically. Local conflicts intensified as captives became currency. Political authority shifted toward those who could control supply routes. Violence did not originate with Europeans, but it was reshaped by European demand. Regions closest to the coast felt this first. Over time, pressure moved inland. Trade corridors extended. Raids expanded. Entire regions reorganized around the export of people. Africa was not drained of labor evenly. It was destabilized selectively. British involvement remained coastal, but its effects reached far beyond the shore. Britain still did not govern African territory. It did not need to. The system rewarded cooperation and punished resistance indirectly. Markets did the work armies would have had to do. In Britain, the influx of plantation goods transformed daily life. Sugar consumption rose sharply. Tobacco became common. Cotton reshaped clothing. These products were no longer luxuries. They became staples. Factories adapted to meet demand. Processing raw materials required machinery, labor, discipline, and energy. Early industrialization drew directly from colonial supply chains. African labor fueled plantation output fueled British industry. The connection was not symbolic, it was mechanical. Ships built for the trade drove shipbuilding innovation. Rope, sails, iron fittings, and navigation tools improved through constant use. Port infrastructure expanded. Logistics became a profession. The Industrial Revolution did not emerge in isolation. It was fed. Africa did not experience industrialization from this system. It experienced extraction. Wealth moved outward. Instability remained behind. Yet British control was still indirect. Forts controlled access points, ships controlled movement, contracts controlled flow. No flag was planted inland. No colonial administration governed daily life. This distinction allowed Britain to deny responsibility. The system was framed as commerce, not domination. African rulers were described as partners. Violence was localized. Distance diluted accountability. But the system hardened. As profits grew, competition intensified. More ships entered the trade. More capital flowed. Margins tightened. Pressure increased at every stage of the triangle. Efficiency became essential. Human life was increasingly subordinated to timing. Delays meant losses. Resistance meant disruption. Disease meant expense. Every problem was reframed as a logistical obstacle. Africa was now locked into a machine that rewarded supply and punished interruption. This machine enriched Britain profoundly. It reshaped its cities. It financed its institutions. It accelerated its transformation into an industrial power. It also produced instability that could not be contained forever. Because systems built on continuous extraction cannot remain balanced indefinitely. They expand until something breaks. The triangle trade machine had reached its most efficient form. The next chapter begins when this efficiency collides with resistance, reform, and the limits of moral distance, and the system begins to fracture. The ocean, in its vastness, seemed indifferent. To sailors and merchants, it was a route, a highway, a corridor of commerce. To the millions packed below deck, it was a tomb in waiting. By the 18th century, the Atlantic had become a carefully engineered artery of profit. Ships were no longer vessels of exploration, they were machines, designed to move human bodies with brutal efficiency. Every plank, every rope, every barrel became part of a system that measured life in cargo units, not in breaths taken or hearts beating. Shipbuilders and traders approached the middle passage with calculation. Hulls were reinforced, decks expanded, and ventilation systems, minimal though they were, designed around the needs of profit rather than survival. The hold was a tight cage of timber and rope. Every inch of space was considered. Every body counted. Two philosophies emerged: tight pack and loose pack. Some captains filled their holds to suffocating density, reasoning that more bodies meant more profit despite higher mortality. Others spaced the enslaved, giving them slightly more room in the hope that fewer deaths would mean greater overall return. It was a cruel calculus. Disease did not care whether a hold was tight or loose. Fever, dysentery, and smallpox swept through these confined spaces with terrifying speed. The human body, deprived of fresh air and nutrition, became a breeding ground for bacteria. Children and the elderly were the first to go, but no one was spared entirely. Sickness moved like a shadow along the boards, infecting, killing, and leaving survivors in shock and grief. The smell of unwashed bodies, of vomit and waste, mingled with the salt air above. Silence was rare. Moans, cries, and the occasional plea to be spared filled the hold. Resistance took many forms. Some tried to escape by jumping overboard, choosing the certainty of the sea over the certainty of enslavement. Others struck at the crew, wielding makeshift weapons, stabbing, biting, and breaking chains when they could. Ships were equipped to respond with force whips, guns, and shackles, but even this violence could not always contain fear, desperation, and the will to survive. Each act of rebellion was met with brutal retaliation, and yet it continued. Humanity persisted even in these narrow, suffocating holds. Insurance companies soon codified the trade's grim realities. Mortality rates became a statistic, a line in a ledger. Traders accepted that a certain percentage of human beings would die, and the systems were designed around this. Ships were insured, captains and merchants compensated, and voyages calculated to maximize profit even in the face of predictable death. The Zong massacre of 1781 starkly revealed this mindset. Over 100 enslaved people, weakened by disease and exhaustion, were thrown overboard to claim insurance. The legal case that followed exposed the cold logic underpinning the trade. Lives were property, and death, if profitable, could be engineered. When the survivors reached the Americas, their ordeal did not end. Auctions awaited them, conducted with meticulous efficiency. Men, women, and children were inspected, categorized, and sold. Families were separated. Mothers watched their children taken to distant plantations. Fathers were torn from their wives. In port towns, the markets themselves became theaters of control, ritualized, normalized, and defended as necessary for commerce. The cries of the enslaved mingled with the calls of traders and the clink of coins, a dissonant symphony that spoke of human suffering measured against profit. Each step of the journey, boarding, crossing, disembarking, was shaped by geography, logistics, and commerce. Ocean currents determined departure schedules. Winds dictated routes. Rivers and ports in West Africa and the Caribbean were nodes in an immense network, each one a site where the machinery of human trafficking turned relentlessly. The enslaved had no choice in these calculations. Every decision favored efficiency, speed, and survival of the trade, never survival of the human beings themselves. The Middle Passage created a new geography of terror. Tight-packed decks, dark below the gunwales, became islands within the ship, spaces where life flickered briefly before being extinguished. Disease, malnutrition, and abuse turned them into graveyards at sea. Some captains prided themselves on clean holds, others on the sheer number they could transport. The Atlantic became a ledger, a counting room, a mass grave, and a stage for unimaginable endurance. The scale of suffering was staggering, but it was only a measure of efficiency. Each death was accounted for, not mourned, and yet, amid this darkness, patterns emerged. Traders learned to adjust rations, to balance the number of bodies against the expected rate of mortality. Some captains took crude precautions, spacing enslaved people to prevent complete collapse, or providing minimal medical attention to preserve their investment. It was not compassion, it was control. Every decision was an economic one. Every act of survival by the enslaved was a negotiation with systems far larger than any individual. Humanity was reduced to its barest biological form, measured by ability to survive long enough to generate profit. The human cost of efficiency reached a crescendo at the auction block. The labor extracted in the Americas, the wealth amassed in Europe, and the death toll at sea were interconnected. Traders, ship owners, insurers, and consumers all benefited from a system that depended on bodies as capital. Families were fractured. Cultures were uprooted. Lives were measured, bought, and sold. The Atlantic became not just a trade route, but a mechanism of death, a river of human suffering whose impact reverberated across generations. In this chapter, the Middle Passage emerges as the engine's dark core. It was not merely a journey but an institution. It combined geography, economics, and engineering in a way that prioritized profit above human life. Each plank of the ship, each ration of food, each record in the ledger reinforced the same truth. Efficiency had a human cost, and that cost was staggering. Resistance could delay it, courage could defy it, and endurance could survive it, but the machinery itself was relentless, unfeeling, and precise. By the time ships docked in the Americas, the scale of loss became fully visible. Survivors were a fraction of those who had boarded in Africa. Families were gone, communities destroyed. The shock of the Middle Passage was not simply physical but cultural, emotional, and generational. It left a mark on every person it touched, and on every society it entered. The Atlantic, once a bridge for commerce, had become a graveyard. And yet, this system did not collapse. It adapted. It refined itself. Every lesson learned at sea was codified into shipping manuals, insurance contracts, and port regulations. What had been horror became routine. Human suffering was normalized, recorded, and monetized. The world had entered a new era of industrialized cruelty, where efficiency and profit overshadowed empathy and life itself. The consequences of the Middle Passage rippled far beyond the Atlantic. Populations in Africa were destabilized. European economies grew richer. The Americas were transformed. But the true measure of the journey, the lives lost, the families torn apart, the cultures fractured, was impossible to quantify. It was felt in the silence of the holds, in the echoes of cries that never reached land, in the absence of the ancestors who might have lived. This dark core of the Atlantic system reminds us that the machinery of trade and empire was not abstract. It had flesh and blood, and it demanded a price. Efficiency was pursued with precision, and death was accepted as inevitable. Survival was both a triumph and a tragedy, a small victory in a vast, engineered system of loss. The Middle Passage teaches that the logic of profit can transform geography, technology, and even human resilience into instruments of suffering. It shows that systems can become self-perpetuating, that cruelty can be rationalized, and that the shadow of these decisions can extend for centuries. And in the end, the balance they found would not last. The systems of death were visible now, their mechanisms understood. The next chapter would confront the societies built on this foundation, testing the limits of endurance, morality, and justice. Africa, in European eyes, was often seen as a passive backdrop, a space upon which the machinery of trade could operate unimpeded. That view, however, was a fiction. Across the continent, powerful states, complex societies, and sophisticated networks of influence shaped every aspect of interaction with Europeans. Control was never once out at Britain, with all its ships, its guns, and its merchants, found that African actors were decisive, active, and often unyielding. The Atlantic trade was not imposed, it was negotiated, contested, and sometimes blocked entirely. Along the West African coast, kingdoms and city-states had long histories of commerce, diplomacy, and warfare. Their leaders understood the value of European goods, the power of firearms, and the leverage they could extract from controlling access to resources and people. Ports were gateways, not just points of departure, and inland networks extended their influence far beyond the shoreline. Brokers, chiefs, and traders regulated who could pass, who could trade, and on what terms. European merchants, arriving with contracts and coins, often discovered that their plans depended entirely on local permission and cooperation. Some African states wielded that power with remarkable precision. The Asante Kingdom, in what is now Ghana, used both military might and strategic diplomacy to dictate terms of trade. They levied taxes on passing European ships, demanded tributes, and, when necessary, expelled those who overstepped their bounds. Other polities, such as Dahomey and Oyo, maintained extensive networks of agents and brokers inland. These intermediaries controlled supply routes, monitored the movement of captives, and could halt or redirect trade at will. It was a system that required Europeans to negotiate continually, often at the edge of patience and profit. Conflict, when it arose, was rarely simple. The Comenda Wars of the late 17th century illustrate the tension between European ambition and African authority. Dutch and British merchants, each seeking dominance in the lucrative gold and slave trades, found themselves drawn into local rivalries. Alliances shifted as local leaders leveraged European firepower against rivals. And Europeans, in turn, learned that victory depended less on naval superiority than on negotiating skill and bribery. Forts could be built and rebuilt, but they could not guarantee control. A single well-placed blockade, a carefully timed ambush along a river, or a shift in allegiance could undo months of investment. European perceptions of African power often missed its subtlety. Control was exercised not only through force, but through the regulation of trade networks, the monitoring of routes, and the ability to incentivize or punish compliance. Chiefs and traders knew the value of scarcity. Limiting access to captives, redirecting caravans, or charging higher tolls could extract enormous profits. For African leaders, the trade was not merely about selling people. It was about asserting sovereignty, leveraging opportunity, and maintaining equilibrium in a volatile landscape of shifting alliances. Resistance took many forms. Escapes from coastal holding areas, raids on European warehouses, and sabotage of ships in port were common, though often unrecorded in European logs. Individuals, small communities, and even entire towns exerted agency, disrupting the flow of trade in ways that Europeans struggled to counter. Enslaved people who reached the coast often had networks of kinship or local knowledge to aid their flight, and captains learned quickly that no ship was immune to subversion. Every voyage, every cargo, carried the shadow of African resistance. The limits of European control were also evident in warfare between African states themselves. Conflicts such as the Comenda Wars, the wars between Dahomey and its neighbors, or periodic revolts along the Niger Delta, often had the effect of redirecting trade, closing ports, and destabilizing the operations of merchants. European armies were rarely equipped to intervene decisively inland. Guns and forts mattered on the coast, but beyond those narrow corridors, African states could assert authority with mobility, knowledge of terrain, and disciplined forces. Local actors dictated the rhythm of commerce more than any European strategy ever could. Shifting alliances were another tool of control. Chiefs could switch allegiances between competing European powers, extracting more favorable terms, better goods, or military support. The Dutch, Portuguese, British, and French often found themselves outmaneuvered by the same African leaders they sought to dominate. Strategic patience, negotiation, and the subtle manipulation of European rivalries were part of the continent's invisible architecture of power. The narrative of European dominance often ignored these maneuvers, but the effects were unmistakable. Britain, for all its firepower and ambition, never fully controlled African trade. Economics alone could not secure compliance. Geography remained a barrier, both natural and engineered. Rivers, swamps, dense forests, and seasonal flooding dictated the movement of goods and captives. Inland towns held strategic choke points where a few well-positioned warriors could halt or redirect a caravan. Roads were controlled by local authorities who could tax, bribe, or blockade. Even in port, European fortifications could be bypassed through negotiation or pressure inland. The landscape itself was a participant in resistance, a silent ally to those who understood it. The psychological dimensions of control were equally significant. African leaders understood the limits of European endurance, their reliance on local supply lines, and their vulnerability to disease, theft, and logistical disruption. European officers who underestimated these factors often suffered delays, loss of cargo, or outright defeat. Respecting local power was not merely prudent, it was essential for survival. In this context, the Atlantic trade was a negotiation with reality itself. Climate, terrain, politics, and human agency all constrained ambition. Yet the continent's resistance was not always overt. Subtle forms of negotiation, manipulation, and selective compliance were widespread. Chiefs could agree to trade under certain conditions, delay shipments to extract higher prices, or encourage rival traders to undermine each other. These actions rarely appeared in European reports, but they shaped the flow of commerce profoundly. The narrative of European mastery, so often claimed in contemporary documents, was in fact contingent, fragile, and constantly contested. Individual acts of defiance punctuated these structural realities. Escapes from forts, uprisings in river towns, and sabotage of European equipment were forms of resistance that, while small in scale, had large cumulative effects. Every delayed shipment, every escaped captive, and every disrupted contract represented a challenge to European authority. African agency, exercised in countless small ways, became a persistent obstacle to full control. The implications of these dynamics were profound. British reliance on African intermediaries, the need for constant negotiation, and the reality of sabotage meant that trade was never a straightforward exercise in domination. The empire's reach was extensive, but always mediated. Success depended on cooperation as much as coercion, on compromise as much as conquest. To underestimate African power was to court failure. By the late 18th century, patterns were clear. European forts, cannons, and mercantile wealth could impose temporary authority on a coast. But the interior remained resolutely autonomous. African leaders continued to direct the rhythm of trade, sometimes collaborating, sometimes obstructing, always asserting their agency. Britain, for all its ambition, could extract wealth, but never absolute control. The balance of power on the continent was intricate, contingent, and enduring. This chapter reveals a critical truth. Africa was not passive. Its societies, networks, and leaders shaped the Atlantic trade at every stage. Resistance was woven into the fabric of commerce. Escapes, sabotage, warfare, and diplomacy all reinforced the limits of European power. Geography, strategy, and human agency combined to make the continent a space of negotiation rather than domination. Britain's empire might expand in fleets and forts, but it always did so under the watchful eye of African sovereignty. The interplay of resistance and control also foreshadowed future conflicts. The very systems that Europeans built, coastal forts, trade networks, alliances with local intermediaries, were reliant on African cooperation. Remove that cooperation, and the empire's reach faltered. The strategies of the past became lessons for the future. Domination required negotiation, power required compromise, and trade required recognition of local authority. In the end, the African state's mastery of terrain, politics, and commerce ensured that Britain's ambitions were never absolute. The continent was a dynamic space, alive with decision, strategy, and agency. Every voyage, every shipment, every interaction was shaped by forces Europeans could not fully command. Escape, sabotage, shifting alliances all acted as reminders that control was never complete, that power was never absolute, and that Africa remained the decisive actor in its own history. The consequences of this reality were enduring. European traders learned to negotiate, adapt, and accept partial control. Forts and guns provided only temporary advantage. Coastal wealth was extracted, but inland autonomy persisted. Every policy, every contract, and every military expedition was contingent on African consent, cooperation, or acquiescence. The continent's authority was inescapable, shaping the Atlantic trade as much as any European ship or cannon. And as the empire pressed forward, it became clear that control, even when asserted, carried costs and limits. Africa's political, geographic, and human realities imposed constraints that no fleet could overcome. Britain, with all its ambition, had to acknowledge this truth. The balance of power was fragile, provisional, and contested. The next chapter would explore how these dynamics shaped European strategies in the Americas, where the limits of control at home reverberated across the Atlantic, forcing new adaptations, compromises, and confrontations. Africa's agency ensured that the story of empire was never a story of unchecked domination. The late 18th century saw a profound transformation in Britain's relationship to the Atlantic world. For over 2 centuries, the empire had built itself on trade that depended on human suffering. Ships, forts, ports, and markets had moved millions of people across oceans as commodities, and the machinery of profit had seemed unbreakable. Yet, within this system, moral questioning emerged. It was not sudden, nor was it uniform, but it gathered force with the persistence of conscience, the rhythm of advocacy, and the careful work of strategy. By the early 1800s, Britain faced a choice: continue the trade, with all its efficiencies and profits, or confront the moral and political consequences of slavery. At the forefront were voices that demanded attention. The Quakers, a religious community with a long commitment to ethical living, had opposed slavery for decades. Their pamphlets, petitions, and assemblies spread a vision of commerce without cruelty, of trade unbound from suffering. They were meticulous, sober, and persistent. Their influence was not dramatic in spectacle, but it was relentless in reach. Quaker networks in London, Bristol, and Liverpool connected with allies across the empire, forming a web that could challenge the entrenched habits of merchants and politicians. Into this environment stepped William Wilberforce, a parliamentarian whose public life became synonymous with the abolitionist cause. His efforts were sustained over decades, a blend of patience, rhetoric, and careful timing. Wilberforce understood that moral arguments alone would not sway the House of Commons. The machinery of law, the habits of commerce, and the power of entrenched interests required strategy as much as conscience. Parliamentary debates stretched for hours, days, and years. Speeches were carefully constructed, referencing law, scripture, economy, and ethics. Each argument sought to undermine the belief that slavery was merely a natural condition or an economic necessity. Equally significant was the voice of the enslaved themselves. Alauda Hiquiano's memoir, published in 1789, offered an unflinching account of life under enslavement. He described the Middle Passage, the auctions, the violence, and the psychological toll with clarity and humanity. Readers across Britain were confronted with testimony that could not be abstracted into numbers or cargo units. It was one thing to debate mortality rates. It was another to read, in vivid detail, the experience of someone who had endured the ocean's hold and survived. Equiano's narrative bridged oceans and classes. It gave life to statistics and legitimacy to moral outrage. Campaigns extended beyond pamphlets and memoirs. Public imagery, broadsheets, and engravings reached a population increasingly literate and attentive to current affairs. Illustrations of chained captives, of shackles, and of auction blocks were circulated deliberately. They were meant to shock, to create empathy, and to disrupt the sense of inevitability that had surrounded the trade for generations. These images were not mere propaganda, they were evidence, intended to make moral abstraction concrete. The average Briton, confronted with such scenes, was invited to reckon with the human cost that had long been buried behind ledger entries and fortified walls. Political turbulence in Europe amplified these efforts. War with revolutionary France disrupted trade networks and shifted parliamentary priorities. The empire faced threats to commerce, to security, and to governance. Yet this upheaval also created openings. With attention focused on national survival, moral arguments for ending the slave trade could be linked to strategic benefit. Abolitionists argued that Britain's moral authority would strengthen its international position, that the empire could claim leadership in a world moving toward ethical commerce. In this way, strategy and conscience converged. Ending the trade became not only a moral imperative but a geopolitical calculation. The debates in Parliament were intense. Opponents warned of economic collapse, of lost revenue, and of diminished global influence. Merchants testified to the indispensability of enslaved labor to plantations, ports, and shipping. Abolitionists responded with data, testimony, and appeals to national character. The rhetoric was precise, deliberate, and exhausting. No single argument prevailed overnight. The process required persistence, negotiation, and the careful timing of votes. Each parliamentary session was a stage on which both moral and pragmatic claims were weighed. By 1807, the efforts bore fruit. The passage of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act marked a historic turning point. Britain formally banned the trade across the Atlantic. Ships could no longer legally transport human beings as cargo. Parliament celebrated the measure, newspapers announced it with fervor, and abolitionists saw the culmination of decades of work. Yet the law was limited. It addressed the trade, not the system of exploitation that persisted in the Americas and the Caribbean. Plantations continued to operate, and millions remained enslaved. The legislation was a first step, not a conclusion. The machinery of oppression had not been dismantled, it had been partially restrained. The moral and strategic convergence that produced abolition was delicate. It depended on public opinion, religious advocacy, political maneuvering, and timing within a global context of conflict. It was a lesson in the complexity of change. Morality alone could not achieve reform. Strategy alone would not suffice. The two, working together, reshaped policy. Britain's role in the Atlantic world shifted, but only in a specific, calculated way. The empire remained deeply implicated in exploitation, though it now claimed, at least in principle, a moral rectitude it had never before acknowledged. The law's passage also demonstrated the limits of national action. Britain could outlaw its own ships, but other nations continued the trade. Portugal, Spain, and France maintained operations, often with impunity. Smuggling persisted. Enforcement across thousands of miles of coastline was impossible. The Atlantic trade, long engineered for efficiency, adapted to new constraints. Abolition forced a recalibration, but it did not immediately end suffering. Economic incentives, political laxity, and geographic realities ensured that human exploitation continued. Resistance, testimony, and advocacy did not cease with the law. Abolitionists recognized that ending the trade was merely the opening act. Enforcement became a struggle. The Royal Navy, increasingly involved in patrolling the African coast, intercepted illegal shipments, but these operations were limited and often dangerous. The human consequences persisted. Ships found ways to circumvent regulations, and captives continued to endure the horrors of the Middle Passage, even under new legal frameworks. Moral progress was uneven, incomplete, and contested. The Act of 1807 also reshaped public consciousness. Britain now had to reconcile pride in legislation with the realities of ongoing enslavement. For citizens, this created cognitive tension. National identity became intertwined with claims of ethical leadership. Even as economic benefit from plantations continued to flow, merchants adjusted, investors recalculated, and policymakers weighed enforcement against profit. Abolition became a test case for whether morality could coexist with empire, whether ethical claims could withstand the inertia of global commerce. Olaudah Equiano and his contemporaries recognized both the victory and its limits. Their writings emphasized endurance, vigilance, and the ongoing struggle for freedom. The act of abolition was celebrated, but not naively. It was a reminder that legislative achievement could not erase centuries of systemic violence, nor could it immediately alter the entrenched social and economic hierarchies that had developed under slavery. For survivors and their descendants, the law was symbolic as much as it was practical. The public campaigns of the 1780s and 1790s had also demonstrated a profound truth. Sustained advocacy could shape national policy. Broadsheets, petitions, sermons, and memoirs converged to create a moral environment in which politicians could act. Public opinion became a tool, a lever by which the machinery of government could be pressured to change. The convergence of moral outrage, evidence, and strategy illustrated how societies could alter entrenched systems, even ones built on centuries of commerce and coercion. Yet the transition was neither smooth nor immediate. Enforcement on distant coasts remained difficult. Resistance by planters, profiteers, and foreign competitors persisted. The British abolitionist victory was, in effect, a partial success. It reshaped the empire's engagement with the Atlantic, but did not eliminate human exploitation. Moral victory existed alongside strategic pragmatism. Britain had banned the trade, but had not dismantled the structures of enslavement, plantation, or colonial wealth extraction. The complexity of abolition also revealed the interplay between morality and state power. Law enforcement, diplomacy, and military capacity all intersected to make change possible. The Act of 1807 was a legal instrument, but without naval patrols, treaty enforcement, and ongoing political pressure, it would have remained largely symbolic. The victory lay in combining ethical conviction with practical means, legislation with execution, advocacy with diplomacy. Change, in this sense, was a lesson in patience and persistent engagement. The story of abolition, moreover, illuminates the limits of unilateral action. Britain's leadership created ripple effects, pressuring other nations to follow suit. Yet each case depended on local enforcement and compliance. Portugal and Spain, for example, continued to operate within existing systems, challenging British authority. Abolition became not a moral endpoint, but the beginning of a protracted struggle in which ethics, economics, and international politics were intertwined. In the end, the passage of the 1807 Act reshaped Britain's role in the Atlantic world. The empire moved from being an unrestrained participant in the trade to a state attempting, imperfectly, to impose moral limits. Profit and ethics now collided in the legal arena, producing new strategies, new calculations, and new pressures on merchants, politicians, and the public. It was a transformation as much of consciousness as of law. And yet, the system of exploitation endured. Plantations in the Caribbean continued. Captives still labored under brutal conditions, and the machinery of empire adapted to preserve wealth despite moral injunctions. The Atlantic remained a space of tension between ideals and realities. The act of abolition, while historic, did not erase the patterns of suffering, coercion, and commerce that had defined the previous centuries. Britain had banned the trade but not exploitation itself. As the century turned, the implications became clear. Moral action could shape law, strategy could enforce policy, but neither could fully eradicate deeply embedded systems of human oppression. The campaign for abolition illustrated both the possibility of change and the persistence of constraint. Britain's transformation was profound, yet incomplete. It was a first step, a legal acknowledgement of wrong, and a strategic pivot in imperial policy. The consequences of this transition extended beyond Britain. They affected African societies, European competitors, and the global network of commerce built on human labor. The moral and strategic recalibration altered the Atlantic world, forcing adjustments in logistics, diplomacy, and naval deployment. It was a moment when conscience and calculation intersected, reshaping an empire even as it preserved the structures of exploitation beneath the surface. The abolition of the slave trade was, in short, a milestone, but not a destination. Britain had confronted the contradictions of empire, morality, and profit. Yet the human consequences of centuries of trade remained. Legal change opened new possibilities, yet it also exposed the persistence of injustice. The work of abolitionists had altered policy, public perception, and the empire's moral standing. But the Atlantic, its economies, and its human cargo continued to bear the imprint of centuries of exploitation. This chapter demonstrates that moral victory and strategic action are never identical. Britain could legislate against the trade, yet the structures of slavery endured. Human suffering continued, even under new laws. The Atlantic world had changed, but it had not been healed, and the story was far from over. The limits of control, the persistence of exploitation, and the ongoing struggle for human dignity would shape the next chapter. As Britain confronted the challenge of enforcing abolition and managing the moral and economic consequences of its new role. The transformation had begun, but the path ahead was fraught, contested, and incomplete. With the passage of the 1807 Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, Britain had declared a moral and legal shift. The trade in human beings was now forbidden, at least for British subjects. But the Atlantic remained vast, porous, and resistant. The machinery of commerce, built over centuries, did not simply vanish. Illegal trade persisted. Ships continued to move captives across the ocean, often under flags of convenience, and European competitors ignored Britain's new moral stance. The empire faced a new challenge: enforcement. To meet it, the Royal Navy was reorganized. The West Africa Squadron, a fleet of warships stationed off the coast, became the front line of abolition. Its mission was formidable: intercept slavers, seize ships, free captives, and enforce treaties. Yet the task was perilous and complex. Captains and crews faced not only armed resistance from smugglers, but also the deadly environment of West Africa itself. Disease, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery was as lethal as any cannon. Mortality rates for sailors were high. Service in the squadron demanded endurance, courage, and adaptability. And yet the human cost was rarely recognized in Britain, overshadowed by the moral triumph of interception. Sailors, young men drawn from ports like Portsmouth, Liverpool, and Bristol, endured weeks at sea under oppressive heat, with tropical storms, unfamiliar waters, and the ever-present threat of disease. Ships were cramped, supplies limited, and hygiene minimal. Every boarding of a suspected slaver risked confrontation with armed crews, sometimes backed by local militias. The environment itself seemed hostile, rivers bristling with reeds that hid enemy vessels, coastal fogs masking danger, and the currents of the Gulf of Guinea that could strand even the most experienced sailor. Disease reduced operational capacity as frequently as combat did. Ships often returned to Britain depleted, their crews weakened, yet still celebrated as instruments of moral purpose. Enforcement required legal as well as naval innovation. Britain established mixed courts, tribunals designed to adjudicate captured slaving vessels, composed of British officials and representatives from other treaty-signing nations. The courts assessed evidence, determined legality, and oversaw the liberation of captives. These courts became instruments of imperial authority. They transformed moral law into actionable governance, extending British influence along the coast and into the interior. Every ruling reinforced the empire's presence, shaping political and commercial networks in ways previously reserved for trade and coercion. Yet the courts alone were insufficient. Britain also pursued experimental solutions on land. The settlement of Sierra Leone had begun decades earlier as a refuge for freed and escaped captives, but by the 19th century it became a laboratory for imperial administration. The colony combined humanitarian objectives with strategic control. Freed people were provided land, work, and some autonomy. But the settlement also anchored Britain's authority on the continent, projecting power into surrounding regions. Sierra Leone became both a moral exemplar and a hub of intelligence on the persistence of illegal trade. Freed captives, missionaries, and colonial officials contributed to a network that extended British oversight far beyond the settlement's boundaries. Treaties reinforced this authority. Britain negotiated agreements with African states to allow naval patrols, regulate commerce, and suppress the traffic in captives. Chiefs and rulers were compelled, often reluctantly, to recognize British presence in exchange for trade privileges, protection, or military support. Enforcement was contingent, practical, and constant. The empire relied on African cooperation as much as on its own ships. Geography, again, dictated strategy. Rivers, coastal forts, and inland alliances were vital to monitoring movement and ensuring compliance. The empire's reach extended through negotiation and enforcement alike, demonstrating the integration of moral precept with imperial strategy. Moral justification underpinned all of these operations. Britain framed its presence as a civilizing, liberating force. The navy and courts were not merely instruments of state power. They were agents of freedom. Freed captives were returned to safety. Ships carrying enslaved people were seized, and public reports celebrated the enforcement of law. Yet this moral framing was inseparable from imperial calculation. Control over the coast allowed Britain to dominate trade, secure ports, and project influence inland. Abolition became both a moral and strategic tool. Every patrol, every treaty, every court case reinforced a dual narrative. The empire was righteous, and the empire was powerful. Resistance, however, continued. Smugglers adapted to the squadron's presence. Smaller, faster ships sought hidden coves and rivers. African intermediaries who had long controlled trade routes tested the limits of British enforcement, redirecting commerce and exploiting gaps in naval coverage. Some captives attempted escape before interception, navigating rivers or relying on local communities for shelter. Resistance was both overt and subtle, demonstrating that even under the guise of moral authority, the empire faced persistent challenges. Enforcement was never complete. It was a constant negotiation with geography, human ingenuity, and the enduring inertia of the slave trade. Disease shaped both policy and perception. Mortality among sailors was high. Missions were often interrupted by outbreaks. The human cost was hidden behind rhetoric of heroism and duty. Logs recorded numbers of ships intercepted and captives freed, but seldom the toll of fever or exhaustion among crews. This tension underscored a fundamental aspect of imperial expansion. Moral purpose could justify risk, but nature remained indifferent to law or conscience. Success depended as much on survival against environmental forces as on triumph over human adversaries. Sierra Leone exemplified the intersection of morality and control. The colony's population grew as freed captives arrived, forming a community governed by British administrators but deeply shaped by African experience. Missionaries, naval officers, and colonial officials collaborated to establish schools, courts, and infrastructure. At the same time, the settlement projected influence over surrounding regions, monitoring trade, cultivating alliances, and enforcing treaties. Humanitarian aims and imperial authority were intertwined, creating a model in which morality justified and reinforced control. Mixed courts amplified this effect. Each case of interception sent a clear message. The slave trade was illegal under British authority. The courts adjudicated carefully, recording evidence, confirming violations, and managing the logistics of resettlement for freed captives. The legal framework transformed individual acts of enforcement into systemic power. Coastal towns and inland routes came under scrutiny. Chiefs were compelled to comply or risk exclusion from trade networks. Britain's reach extended beyond ships and cannons into law, governance, and diplomacy. The squadron's success was not absolute, but its influence was enduring. Captains developed tactics to anticipate smugglers' movements, utilizing intelligence from Sierra Leone and local intermediaries. Naval patrols mapped rivers, identified hidden coves, and maintained constant presence at strategic points. Operations were coordinated with treaties, courts, and settlements. Together, these mechanisms formed a network in which moral purpose and strategic control converged. Britain's enforcement became more than occasional seizures, it became sustained authority, extending influence into regions previously governed solely by local powers. Moral justification for this authority was critical. British officers and administrators framed their actions as the defense of freedom. Freed captives, often resettled in Sierra Leone or returned to Africa, were evidence of success. Public reports emphasized liberation, justice, and the triumph of law over brutality. At the same time, these narratives reinforced imperial legitimacy. The projection of moral authority provided cover for political and economic influence, allowing Britain to assert dominance under the guise of ethical action. Abolition thus was inseparable from empire. The period also revealed limits and contradictions. Enforcement depended on local cooperation. African rulers retained agency, sometimes resisting, sometimes manipulating British presence for their own ends. Disease, climate, and distance constrained operations. Smugglers constantly adapted, exploiting gaps in patrols or jurisdiction. Control was not absolute, yet the mechanisms developed during this period laid the foundation for sustained influence. Britain's presence on the West African coast became permanent, institutionalized, and justified in terms of morality, even as it advanced imperial interests. By the 1830s and 1840s, the combined effect of the squadron, courts, settlements, and treaties had reshaped the Atlantic system. Illegal trading declined, ports became centers of British administration, and coastal states adjusted to the new balance of power. Freed captives formed communities that mediated commerce, intelligence, and culture. Sierra Leone became a hub of British influence, linking law, military presence, and humanitarian rhetoric. The empire's moral authority translated directly into political and economic control, a new model of intervention built on the logic of liberation. The consequences extended inland. African leaders, once autonomous in trade, now had to navigate treaties, naval oversight, and new intermediaries. British presence constrained some traditional practices while opening opportunities for others. Authority was layered, negotiated, and constant. Control was exercised not only through ships and forts but through law, diplomacy, and the moral framing of intervention. Britain's empire, in this sense, expanded under the banner of freedom. Morality had become a tool of power. The period also reshaped public perception in Britain. Reports of captured ships, freed captives, and successful operations were circulated in newspapers, lectures, and pamphlets. Sailors' courage, officers' diligence, and administrators' skill were celebrated as evidence of national virtue. Moral authority reinforced global influence. Britain's role was recast. No longer only a participant in commerce, it now claimed to lead the world in enforcing justice and freedom. Yet this claim carried its own contradictions. Freedom was defined selectively, extended strategically, and justified imperial expansion even as inequality persisted. In the end, policing the seas and expanding influence created a new model of empire. Naval power, legal frameworks, colonial settlements, and treaties converged to enforce morality and control simultaneously. The Atlantic, once dominated by profit and human suffering, became a zone where British law, military presence, and ethical narrative shaped outcomes. The empire projected authority under the guise of liberation, intertwining human rights with strategic advantage. But the balance was fragile. Disease continued to claim lives among sailors and freed captives alike. Enforcement was labor-intensive and costly. African states retained agency, exploiting gaps, negotiating terms, and occasionally resisting. The empire's reach was extensive, yet conditional. Control, even under moral justification, remained a constant negotiation between ambition, environment, and human resilience. The story of this era demonstrates the complex interplay between ethics and empire. Britain had claimed to act for freedom, but it did so through mechanisms of power. Naval patrols enforced law, courts adjudicated cases, settlements anchored authority, and treaties expanded influence. Moral purpose became inseparable from imperial strategy. Freed captives, surviving sailors, and African intermediaries all inhabited a system in which liberation and control were intertwined. The West Africa Squadron, mixed courts, and Sierra Leone were more than administrative tools. They were instruments of empire, operating under ethical pretext. The Atlantic was remade as a space of British influence, structured by law, monitored by military presence, and justified through morality. Britain's engagement shifted from exploitation to intervention, from commerce to governance. But the stakes remained human. The challenges environmental, and the consequences political. By the 1860s, the system had become institutionalized. Britain now maintained permanent influence along the West African coast, its authority reinforced by treaties, naval power, legal frameworks, and settlements. Freed captives served as intermediaries, observers, and symbols of moral authority. Enforcement of abolition had become a mechanism for projecting empire. Moral purpose justified and sustained strategic control, creating a new model of influence that intertwined ethical rhetoric with practical governance. The next chapter would explore how this approach shaped wider imperial strategies in Africa and the Atlantic world. Britain's claim to moral authority created new opportunities, but also new tensions. Control in the name of freedom was effective, yet incomplete. The balance of power, like the seas themselves, remained dynamic, uncertain, and contested. The empire had transformed the Atlantic. Moral precept had become power, enforcement had become authority, and freedom had become a rationale for control. But every victory carried cost. The campaign to police the seas, protect the freed, and assert influence demanded human endurance, resources, and constant negotiation. Britain now controlled Africa in the name of freedom, but the moral and strategic calculus that underpinned that control was as complex, perilous, and contingent as the ocean itself. With the formal abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, Britain had recalibrated its engagement with Africa. The ships, forts, and ports that once carried human cargo were now redirected toward other forms of commerce. Freedom, as defined by law, applied to human beings, but the logic of exploitation remained unchanged. The Atlantic economy, the networks of power and wealth, simply adapted. The machinery of profit, honed over centuries of the slave trade, found new commodities, new methods, and new victims. Palm oil emerged as the defining resource of this next phase. In Britain, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Factories required lubricants for machinery. Soap manufacturers sought fats and oils. And markets demanded products that were cheap, abundant, and controllable. Palm oil, harvested from the Niger Delta and surrounding regions, fit these needs precisely. Its production was labor-intensive, but unlike enslaved bodies crossing the Atlantic, it could be extracted under local supervision, marketed as legitimate trade, and framed as morally acceptable. The veneer of legality masked the continuity of coercion. The Niger Delta became central to this transformation. Its rivers, creeks, and estuaries were natural highways for commerce, connecting inland producers with coastal markets and European buyers. Trading posts and forts, once built for the Atlantic slave trade, were repurposed to monitor palm oil, negotiate with chiefs, and control riverine traffic. Geography shaped opportunity. Those who controlled the waterways controlled the flow of the resource. The logic of strategic dominance, honed during the era of human trafficking, now applied to natural commodities. Power was exercised, not over people alone, but over production, transport, and price. Economic control was subtle but pervasive. Credit systems, often disguised as trade agreements, created dependency. African producers borrowed goods, guns, or textiles against future palm oil deliveries. Prices were set by European buyers, who dictated the terms of exchange. Chiefs and intermediaries, once the brokers of enslaved bodies, now regulated access to land, labor, and harvests. Communities were drawn into cycles of debt, obligation, and control. Compliance was enforced not by chains or cannon alone, but by economic necessity. The coercive logic of trade persisted, hidden under the language of commerce. Forced labor systems adapted to these new commodities. Laborers harvested, processed, and transported palm oil under strict oversight. Villages were obliged to meet quotas. Men, women, and children worked in conditions that were arduous, relentless, and sometimes lethal. Mortality remained high, though now framed as part of the natural cost of production rather than moral collapse. Resistance flight, sabotage, or delayed harvests was met with punitive measures. The infrastructure developed during the slave trade, from fortified posts to river monitoring, was now applied to regulate production, ensuring efficiency and profit. Dependency economies emerged. European demand shaped local production cycles, redirecting labor and attention from subsistence farming or internal trade. Communities became tied to the fluctuations of global markets. Price volatility, debt, and coercion reinforced European leverage. The rhetoric of legitimate trade masked the underlying reality. Africa's resources were now the engine of empire, and local populations remained entangled in structures designed to maximize extraction. Exploitation had shifted form, not disappeared. The concept of legitimate trade carried moral and political weight. Britain, having abolished the slave trade, framed its engagement as ethical commerce. Palm oil, ivory, and other resources were presented as products of free labor, traded voluntarily and profitably. Yet on the ground, the mechanisms of control, coercion, and dependency echoed the logic of the Middle Passage. Laborers worked under obligation, chiefs negotiated under duress, and European agents enforced compliance with the threat of force, economic exclusion, or both. Freedom, in practice, was constrained by geography, debt, and imperial oversight. Strategic infrastructure reinforced these patterns. Trading posts along rivers, forts on estuaries, and naval patrols ensured both protection and oversight. European buyers maintained influence over pricing, quality, and access. African intermediaries, once brokers of captives, now brokered palm oil and other commodities, acting as conduits between local producers and imperial demand. Control was exercised across multiple layers: economic, geographic, and political. The empire had learned from the past, adapting coercive systems to new forms of wealth extraction. Resistance persisted, as it always had. Laborers fled plantations or harvest sites. Communities withheld production or diverted goods to alternative markets. Chiefs negotiated aggressively, sometimes manipulating European demand to their advantage. These acts were smaller in scale than the rebellions of enslaved people in the Middle Passage, but their impact was cumulative. The empire's enforcement mechanisms required constant adaptation. Geography, social networks, and local agency ensured that control, though extensive, was never absolute. Mortality remained a hidden factor. Disease, overwork, and poor nutrition affected laborers, sailors, and intermediaries alike. Deaths were normalized within production statistics, as European merchants calculated risk, loss, and profit. The human cost of palm oil extraction mirrored, in many ways, the cost once associated with transporting enslaved people. The commodity had changed, but the logic of exploitation, the combination of labor, risk, and profit, remained constant. The Niger Delta, in particular, became a microcosm of these dynamics. Rivers choked with canoes and barges transporting palm oil, trading posts clustered at strategic junctions, and chiefs asserting control over access and labor. The flow of goods was tightly monitored. European agents dictated the rhythm of commerce, enforcing contracts, inspecting harvests, and mediating disputes. The landscape itself, rivers, swamps, and estuaries shaped opportunity and constraint. Geography remained a central actor, just as it had in the era of the Middle Passage. Economic leverage reinforced imperial influence. Credit systems, monopolies, and price setting ensured that African producers remained dependent on European buyers. Communities could not easily redirect labor to subsistence, farming, or internal markets. European agents maintained authority over access to ports, transportation, and capital. Control was exercised not through overt brutality alone, but through subtle, persistent economic pressure. The empire's logic of extraction had adapted seamlessly from human cargo to natural resources. Resistance, adaptation, and negotiation were constant. African leaders, intermediaries, and laborers found ways to assert agency within these constraints. Quotas were challenged, debts renegotiated, and river routes diverted. Smuggling of goods or circumventing of trade agreements became common. Europeans learned, again, that authority depended on local cooperation as much as on naval or legal enforcement. Geography, social structure, and human ingenuity continued to shape the terms of empire. The moral framing of palm oil trade allowed Britain to project influence without immediate ethical backlash. Newspapers and parliamentary reports emphasized commerce, civilization, and mutual benefit. The rhetoric of legitimate trade obscured the reality of labor, coercion, economic dependency, and systemic exploitation. The empire claimed ethical engagement, even as it maintained hierarchical control over land, labor, and markets. Profit remained the underlying motive, now justified under a different guise and effect. Abolition of the slave trade had transformed, rather than ended, exploitation. Human beings were no longer exported en masse across the Atlantic, but the structures of coercion persisted. Commodities replaced captives, but the combination of debt, labor, obligation, and geographic leverage ensured that African communities remained enmeshed in imperial power. Systems of extraction, dependency, and oversight had adapted to new commodities and new markets. Exploitation had not disappeared. It had evolved. This period also demonstrated the resilience of imperial strategy. Lessons learned during the Atlantic slave trade: control of rivers, fortification of strategic points, negotiation with local elites, and enforcement through economic and military means were applied seamlessly to new commodities. Palm oil, ivory, and other resources became the vehicles of continued influence. The empire had shifted from transporting human lives to regulating natural wealth, but the underlying logic: control, profit, and extraction remained unchanged. The human consequences were tangible. Communities experienced disruption of traditional economies. Laborers endured arduous work, and mortality remained high. Chiefs and intermediaries negotiated under pressure, balancing local authority against European demands. Entire regions became dependent on European markets, reshaping subsistence patterns and social structures. The system was pervasive, adaptive, and persistent. The Atlantic economy, once built on enslaved bodies, now relied on the control of resources, labor, and credit. By the mid-19th century, palm oil trade had become central to industrial Britain. Factories, soapworks, and emerging industries depended on steady supply. Rivers and estuaries of the Niger Delta were lined with trading posts, staffed by European agents and African intermediaries. Forts, patrols, and credit systems ensured the smooth operation of commerce. Enforcement, oversight, and negotiation maintained the flow of goods. Just as naval patrols and mixed courts had maintained the flow of captives decades earlier, efficiency remained paramount, and human suffering remained an unacknowledged cost. The narrative of legitimate trade reinforced the illusion of progress. Europe could claim ethical engagement, technological development, and moral oversight, while exploiting labor, land, and markets. Dependency systems ensured compliance, while geography, culture, and local authority complicated enforcement. Exploitation had been rebranded, but its essence, the extraction of labor and wealth for distant profit, was unchanged. The continuity is striking. The machinery developed for the transatlantic slave trade: ports, forts, credit systems, intermediaries, naval presence was adapted to new commodities. Laborers continued to work under obligation. Chiefs continued to mediate European influence. Rivers, estuaries, and terrain continued to dictate opportunity and constraint. Abolition had not dismantled the system. It had transformed it. Exploitation persisted, invisible in the language of freedom and legitimate commerce, but concrete in labor, debt, and mortality. This chapter demonstrates that exploitation is resilient. It adapts to legal, moral, and economic changes. Palm oil replaced enslaved bodies, credit systems replaced chains, dependency replaced terror, yet the logic of extraction, control, and profit endured. The empire had shifted its tools, but not its purpose. Britain's influence remained pervasive, enforced by a combination of moral authority, economic leverage, and geographic control. Freedom, in this sense, was partial, selective, and instrumental. The story of palm oil and legitimate trade reminds us that systems of exploitation are not easily dismantled. They evolve, reconfigure, and persist. Human suffering continues, now obscured by language, legality, and commodity form. Economic dependency, labor coercion, and geographic oversight ensure the endurance of imperial influence. The empire adapts, but the underlying mechanics of control remain. The next chapter would examine how these patterns of exploitation and control expanded across Africa and into other commodities, setting the stage for industrial, colonial, and political domination in the late 19th century. The transformation from humans to resources was complete, but the logic of extraction and the suffering it entailed remained central to the empire's expansion. Exploitation adapts. It does not disappear. By the mid-19th century, the Atlantic world had changed. The transatlantic slave trade was outlawed. Palm oil and other resources had become the new engine of commerce, and Britain had established both naval and legal dominance along the coast. Yet the empire's gaze was shifting further inland. Control over rivers, forests, and plains demanded knowledge, and knowledge itself had become a form of power. Exploration was no longer simply a pursuit of curiosity, it was a prerequisite for conquest. Expeditions traced the courses of the Niger, the Nile, and the Congo. Rivers that had long been lifelines for African commerce were now studied as highways for imperial penetration. British explorers charted tributaries, documented seasonal flooding, and mapped the positions of villages, forts, and natural resources. These journeys were arduous, often deadly, and always dependent on local guidance. African knowledge, expertise, and courage were indispensable. Local guides understood currents, hidden channels, seasonal patterns, and the hazards of disease and terrain. They provided maps in practice, even as Europeans took credit in writing. Yet the historical record would erase them. Journals, reports, and publications presented exploration as a European achievement. Names of African guides, interpreters, and collaborators were seldom recorded. Their labor, knowledge, and lives were subsumed into the narrative of European heroism. The empire depended on them, but the story of empire would not acknowledge that dependency. Maps, sketches, and reports bore European signatures. But the substance of those discoveries came from those whose voices were silenced. Missionaries followed explorers, interpreting their findings through spiritual and cultural lenses. Mission schools were established in coastal towns and, eventually, further inland. Education, literacy, and religious instruction became instruments of influence. Communities were encouraged, sometimes coerced, to adopt new forms of worship, new calendars, and new codes of behavior. Conversion was framed as moral improvement, yet it served strategic ends. Those who understood European religion, language, and literacy were more easily incorporated into systems of commerce, administration, and control. Knowledge and faith became tools of governance. Cultural transformation accompanied the expansion of influence. Missionaries recorded languages, classified customs, and published descriptions of African societies. While this information was often intended as moral or religious instruction, it simultaneously provided practical intelligence for imperial administrators. Communities were reshaped subtly, adopting European educational models, agricultural practices, and social norms. These changes were often presented as benevolent, yet they created avenues of influence, aligning local populations with imperial priorities. Knowledge became a method of control, soft as much as hard. Maps were the most potent instruments of empire. Cartography transformed geography into law. Rivers, mountains, and towns were drawn with precision. Each line a claim, each annotation a legal assertion. Maps were not neutral. They were declarations of authority. Treaties and agreements were underpinned by geographic knowledge. European powers interpreted mapped spaces as property, ignoring the complex and fluid systems of land use and political authority that had existed for centuries. Knowledge itself was conquest. The more accurate the map, the more enforceable the claim. Explorers documented not only terrain but also trade routes, resource locations, and political structures. Rivers like the Niger and the Congo were studied for navigability, potential fort sites, and proximity to fertile land. Tributary villages were recorded, as were seasonal patterns of flooding and disease. This information allowed planners in London to imagine expansion, allocate resources, and prepare for governance. Exploration was not curiosity, it was preparation. Every river surveyed, every village catalogued, every map drawn translated knowledge into potential control. Yet exploration was dangerous. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Canoe travel along rivers was slow, perilous, and dependent on local expertise. Supplies were limited, storms were unpredictable, and relations with communities could turn hostile. European expeditions relied on local guides not only for navigation but also for diplomacy, negotiation, and survival. The success of missions depended entirely on those whose knowledge was invisible in the records. Every map, every survey, every expedition report was built on human labor that was rarely acknowledged. Missionaries were often the first sustained European presence inland. They built schools, churches, and hospitals. They taught literacy and religious texts, often replacing indigenous education and belief systems. By recording languages, genealogies, and customs, missionaries preserved knowledge that would later be used for administration, taxation, and governance. Spiritual conversion was framed as moral duty, yet it created social cohesion aligned with European authority. The empire expanded not only through guns and forts, but through ideas, literacy, and faith. Knowledge became both shield and spear. Mapping, in particular, enabled the transformation of geography into enforceable law. Treaties were justified by maps, rivers became boundaries, and fort locations became markers of jurisdiction. By the 1860s, the interior was no longer unknown. It was measured, plotted, and interpreted. European administrators claimed authority over spaces that had long been governed by local norms. Mapping was selective. Areas deemed profitable, strategic, or morally relevant were prioritized. Knowledge, codified on paper, allowed distant administrators to make decisions with far-reaching consequences. African communities continued to exercise agency, despite the advances of exploration and missionary work. Villages could withhold labor, redirect trade, or resist religious instruction. Guides, interpreters, and local officials negotiated terms, often exploiting European ignorance of terrain and politics. Geography was not simply conquered. It was navigated, mediated, and contested. The empire's reach depended on local cooperation as much as on European initiative. Resistance persisted, subtle and continuous, even in the shadow of maps and missions. Exploration also reshaped perception in Europe. Journals, reports, and lectures presented Africa as a space of potential, awaiting moral and administrative organization. Rivers and forests became pathways for governance, mapped and measured for strategic advantage. Missionaries' observations informed public debate, illustrating both the challenges and opportunities of inland engagement. Knowledge of terrain, communities, and resources allowed the empire to plan expansion with precision previously impossible. Exploration was preparation for control, and knowledge became an instrument of policy. The dual role of missionaries was especially significant. They were moral agents and informants. They mediated between European officials and local communities, interpreting customs, advising on governance, and often framing European policy as morally justified. Mission schools taught reading and writing, but also loyalty, compliance, and cultural norms aligned with European priorities. Communities were gradually reshaped, adopting European practices, calendars, and beliefs. Conversion, literacy, and education became forms of soft power, complementing military and economic influence. Knowledge prepared the way for authority. Maps codified the empire's reach. Geographic surveys recorded rivers, ports, and hinterlands. Tributaries, villages, and settlements were noted with detail. Topography was classified, soil quality assessed, and waterways measured for navigability. These instruments allowed London-based planners to assert control without constant presence. Authority could be extended over vast distances, justified by knowledge rather than immediate coercion. Knowledge itself became a form of dominion. Mapped space was claimed space, surveyed and sanctioned, waiting for enforcement. The legacy of these expeditions is double-edged. On one hand, Africa was documented, its geography and cultures preserved in unprecedented detail. On the other, the human contributions to these discoveries were obscured. Guides, translators, and local informants were essential to every journey, yet their names are absent from most records. The empire's claim to knowledge and authority rested on the labor of those whom history would forget. Maps, journals, and reports became instruments of erasure as well as tools of conquest. Cultural transformation accompanied geographic exploration. Mission schools reoriented local education. European calendars and measurements were adopted, and Christian religious practices reshaped social life. Knowledge of European norms became a prerequisite for engagement in trade, governance, and diplomacy. The empire used moral, educational, and cultural instruments to extend authority. Exploration was therefore not only a matter of rivers or maps. It was the preparation of societies to be governed, aligned with European structures, and incorporated into imperial systems. By the 1860s, the interior of Africa was no longer unknown to Britain. Rivers like the Niger, Nile, and Congo had been surveyed, mapped, and recorded. Missionaries had established schools and converted communities. Settlements and trading posts created nodes of authority. The empire had laid the groundwork for administration, trade control, and political influence. Knowledge had become the foundation of conquest. Without these surveys, without these maps, without this cultural transformation, later colonial expansion would have been impossible. Exploration was both practical preparation and ideological justification. Yet the limits of this knowledge were evident. Disease, geography, and local resistance continued to constrain European movement. Maps were often incomplete, guides were essential, and environmental hazards remained lethal. Authority was dependent on interpretation, negotiation, and continuous adaptation. Exploration did not guarantee domination. It prepared the ground, but control required ongoing engagement, enforcement, and strategy. Knowledge facilitated empirate, did not automatically impose it. This chapter illustrates the intimate link between observation, documentation, and power. Exploration created maps. Missionaries created literacy, moral authority, and cultural alignment. Together, they produced the knowledge infrastructure necessary for imperial expansion. African guides, laborers, and communities provided the substance of discovery, yet the empire claimed the credit. Knowledge was weaponized, coded into maps, records, and institutions, and deployed as the first step toward domination. The consequences were profound. By the late 1860s, Britain possessed the tools to project influence deep into Africa's interior. Rivers, forests, and settlements were documented and understood. Cultural and religious transformation had created intermediaries, interpreters, and compliant communities. Legal claims, justified by mapping, could be enforced through treaties and forts. The empire's reach was extended far beyond the coastlines that had once defined it. Exploration had prepared Africa for imperial authority. Knowledge had become conquest, and yet, this preparation was neither complete nor uncontested. Local communities retained agency. Guides, intermediaries, and leaders continued to negotiate, resist, and manipulate European presence. Geography remained a constraining factor, disease remained lethal, and maps were imperfect instruments. The empire's authority, though expanding, required constant adaptation, intelligence, and enforcement. Exploration created opportunity, but it did not eliminate the complex realities of African societies. The stage was now set for the next phase of empire, formal colonial expansion. Knowledge, maps, and missionaries had created the conditions under which administration, control, and economic exploitation could be imposed systematically. The empire had learned to navigate rivers, negotiate with communities, and transform societies. Exploration had provided the intelligence. Cultural and religious intervention had prepared the ground. Africa's interior was no longer unknown. The continents, landscapes, peoples, and resources had been surveyed, categorized, and made legible to imperial planners. The lessons of this era are clear. Conquest begins with knowledge. Maps transform territory into claims. Missionaries align societies with imperial norms, and exploration translates the unknown into manageable space. The empire's success depended on observation, documentation, and cultural adaptation as much as on military or economic might. Knowledge itself became a tool of power, and preparation became the first stage of domination. The next chapter would examine how this groundwork rivers mapped. Societies converted, and resources documented enabled the formal colonial empires of the late 19th century. Exploration, education, and cartography had set the stage. Britain was now poised to move from influence to control, and the mechanisms of empire were ready to be deployed with unprecedented precision. Exploration prepared the empire. Knowledge became conquest. By the early 1880s, Africa's interior was no longer unknown to Europe. Rivers had been mapped, communities catalogued, and resources documented. Missionaries, explorers, and trading agents had paved the way. Yet knowledge alone was not enough to satisfy imperial ambition. Europe's industrial powers were now locked in intense competition. Coalitions, rivalries, and nationalist sentiment converged, turning maps into battlegrounds and treaties into instruments of exclusion. The scramble for Africa had begun. The driving force was both economic and political. Industrialization had created insatiable demand for raw materials: rubber, palm oil, ivory, cotton, and minerals. European manufacturers sought not just access but control, ensuring steady supply and monopoly profits. Simultaneously, nationalist sentiment in Europe made overseas possession a matter of prestige and power. Africa was no longer simply a site of trade or moral intervention. It was a chessboard upon which rival empires measured strength, influence, and ambition. Diplomatic tensions escalated. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium each claimed strategic advantages based on prior trade, exploration, or coastal settlements. Yet overlapping claims and conflicting interests threatened to ignite war. Disputes over the Niger, the Congo, and the Zambezi demonstrated that knowledge, while essential, was insufficient without enforcement. The stakes were immense. Control over land, labor, and resources now justified military presence, treaties, and administrative innovation. It was in this context that the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 convened. Organized by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany, the conference sought to establish rules for the partition of Africa, ostensibly to avoid conflict among European powers. African leaders were not invited. Their presence was neither considered necessary nor desirable. The conference codified the principle of effective occupation. Claims on African territory required more than maps and treaties. They demanded administration, enforcement, and ultimately, the willingness to use violence. Paper boundaries alone were insufficient. European negotiators relied heavily on maps. Rivers, mountains, and settlement locations were plotted meticulously. Lines were drawn with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or political realities on the ground. Communities that had long existed within flexible, overlapping jurisdictions were suddenly assigned to empires they had never acknowledged. Rivers became borders. Villages were split. Chiefs, once autonomous and adaptable, found themselves subordinated to foreign authority. Cartography, once a tool of knowledge, now became an instrument of coercion. Each stroke of ink implied power, but every border would require enforcement to be meaningful. The principle of effective occupation reshaped imperial strategy. European powers realized that claiming territory on paper was only the first step. The land had to be controlled. Chartered companies, military expeditions, and administrative outposts proliferated. In the Congo, King Leopold II of Belgium authorized the Congo Free State, a private empire ruled by a single monarch under the guise of philanthropy and civilization. Britain, France, and Germany established similar entities, blending commercial exploitation with state oversight. Authority was exercised through forts, patrols, and coercive labor systems. Violence was not incidental. It was central. Chartered companies became the primary instruments of imperial enforcement. They operated with legal sanction but often acted with autonomy, raising armed forces, imposing taxes, and regulating labor. Companies such as the British South Africa Company and the German East Africa Company claimed vast tracts of land, extracting resources and controlling local populations. Coercion was routine. Labor was enforced through intimidation, violence, and economic dependency. The rhetoric of civilization and progress masked a continuity of exploitation that mirrored earlier systems of slavery and forced labor. Borders drawn on maps were meaningless without enforcement. Rivers, mountain ranges, and deserts were nominal limits. The reality required occupation. European powers dispatched expeditions into the interior, encountering resistance from African states, kingdoms, and communities. Military technology, including repeating rifles and artillery, gave Europeans an advantage, but campaigns were costly, dangerous, and logistically complex. Disease, geography, and determined local resistance tested imperial capacity. Effective occupation demanded planning, intelligence, and persistence. Knowledge became enforcement, and enforcement required human and material cost. Resistance was widespread. African polities did not accept European claims passively. Kingdoms such as the Ashanti, Zulu, and modest Sudanese resisted occupation, sometimes with remarkable success. Guerrilla tactics, fortified settlements, and alliances challenged imperial advances. In some cases, European forces were defeated or forced to withdraw temporarily. Resistance revealed the fragility of paper claims. Maps could be drawn, treaties signed, but the ground itself had to be conquered. Violence became the language through which authority was communicated. The Berlin Conference also codified principles for negotiation and dispute resolution among European powers. Conflicts over territory were to be arbitrated diplomatically, yet the logic of arbitration reinforced imperial prerogatives. Africa was treated as a resource-rich chessboard, divided without consent or consultation. Diplomacy among Europeans determined control over land and labor, while African agency was marginalized or erased. The consequences of these decisions would be felt for generations. Paper borders required the imposition of real authority, and that authority was built on coercion. The Congo Free State exemplifies the extremity of this system. Leopold II claimed sovereignty over a vast interior, ostensibly to abolish slavery and promote civilization. In practice, labor was enforced through brutal quotas, hostage-taking, and systematic violence. Palm oil, rubber, and ivory were extracted under coercion, while infrastructure and administration reinforced control. Reports of atrocities shocked Europe when they surfaced decades later. But at the time, such systems were seen as legitimate mechanisms of occupation, justified by treaties, maps, and claims to civilization. In West Africa, similar patterns emerged. Coastal forts, river patrols, and inland expeditions enforced European claims. Chiefs were co-opted, coerced, or removed. Communities were reorganized to facilitate administration and resource extraction. Trade, once flexible and negotiated, was tightly regulated to benefit European interests. Paper borders became functional boundaries only through military, administrative, and economic pressure. Violence was not incidental. It was an integral component of empire. Logistics played a decisive role. European powers built roads, railways, and ports to link interior resources with coastal markets. These projects required labor, often coerced, and were fraught with mortality from disease, exhaustion, and accidents. Geography dictated strategy. Rivers had to be navigable, mountains crossed, forests cleared. Military garrisons and administrative posts secured infrastructure, ensuring that the lines on maps were enforceable. Knowledge, planning, and execution converged in the service of imperial authority. The human cost of the scramble was immense. African communities faced forced labor, displacement, and violent subjugation. Chiefs were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Resistance was met with overwhelming force. Disease and famine compounded suffering. For Europeans, the interior remained dangerous. Expeditions suffered high mortality from tropical illnesses, attacks by resisting groups, and accidents. Occupation required endurance, sacrifice, and coordination. Paper borders demanded real violence, and the cost was borne on both sides. The scramble reshaped political and economic structures across the continent. Traditional systems of governance were disrupted. Trade networks were reoriented to European markets. Taxation, labor obligations, and land appropriation transformed daily life. African polities were forced into negotiation, compliance, or confrontation. Authority was layered. European administrators, company agents, and military officers imposed oversight, while local intermediaries mediated and sometimes resisted. The empire's reach was extensive, yet constantly contested. Maps were not neutral instruments. They were active tools of conquest. Surveyors delineated territories, rivers were labeled as boundaries, and villages were assigned to distant capitals. Treaties referenced coordinates, and claims were justified through geographic precision. Knowledge itself became authority. Yet the reality of occupation revealed the limits of cartography. Lines on paper required forts, patrols, and coercion to become enforceable. Geography, resistance, and logistics tested the empire at every turn. The principle of effective occupation reshaped imperial governance. Territory had to be administered, taxes collected, and labor regulated. Military presence was permanent, not episodic. European states established bureaucracies to oversee these processes, often working through chartered companies. Authority was multi-layered, blending state oversight with private enterprise. Coercion and administration intertwined, creating systems that were both functional and brutal. Violence was embedded in governance. By 1885, Africa was divided on paper. Britain controlled vast stretches of West Africa and Southern Africa. France claimed West and Central African territories. Germany secured its East African and Southwest African holdings. Belgium dominated the Congo. Portugal maintained coastal enclaves. Yet these divisions were fragile. Occupation was uneven, resistance persistent, and enforcement costly. The scramble had established claims, but the reality on the ground required constant intervention. Paper borders demanded real violence. The scramble also intensified European rivalries. Colonial offices monitored competitors, dispatched expeditions, and negotiated treaties to secure advantage. Knowledge, maps, and surveys became instruments of strategy. Diplomacy, military campaigns, and administration were coordinated to maximize control. The pace of occupation accelerated, with governments and chartered companies racing to consolidate authority before rivals could intervene. Speed became both practical necessity and political imperative. African resistance remained pervasive. Communities organized uprisings, fortified settlements, and engaged in guerrilla campaigns. Leaders negotiated alliances, shifted loyalties, and exploited European rivalries. Resistance slowed occupation, imposed costs, and tested imperial assumptions. Military superiority, while decisive in many instances, could not eliminate agency, knowledge, or strategy on the part of African polities. Paper borders required enforcement, and enforcement demanded continuous confrontation. The scramble also reshaped economic systems. Traditional trade networks were subordinated to imperial markets. Labor obligations, taxation, and resource extraction became central to administration. Chartered companies extracted raw materials while European governments enforced claims. Infrastructure, roads, railways, ports was constructed to connect interior resources with global markets. Geography, labor, and capital were integrated to sustain empire. Violence, economic leverage, and coercion underpinned all operations. The Berlin Conference thus represents both a formalization of imperial ambition and a prelude to conflict. By codifying rules, Europe avoided inter-imperial war, but it also institutionalized a system of domination. Africa was parceled, communities subordinated, and rulers marginalized. Authority depended on knowledge, administration, and force. Paper borders were meaningless without enforcement, and enforcement required ongoing violence, coercion, and negotiation. The logic of empire demanded continuity between maps, treaties, and action. The scramble had enduring consequences. Borders drawn in Berlin ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural realities, creating challenges that would persist into the 20th century. Indigenous authority was subordinated, economies reoriented, and social systems transformed. The human cost was immense, both in terms of resistance and in the daily imposition of labor, taxation, and violence. European control had been formalized, but at the expense of local autonomy, life, and social cohesion. In essence, the scramble for Africa demonstrates that imperial ambition required more than knowledge or demanded action. Maps could declare ownership, treaties could justify claims, but the realities of geography, resistance, and logistics required permanent presence. Chartered companies, military expeditions, and administrative networks enforced authority. Paper borders were tools, not solutions, and their legitimacy rested on violence, coercion, and strategic execution. By the end of 1885, the stage was set for formal colonial administration across the continent. Europe had divided Africa on paper, but the work of occupation, enforcement, and resource extraction had just begun. The scramble established the framework for empire, but the realities of control required continued vigilance, violence, and adaptation. Paper borders demand real violence. By the late 19th century, Europe had carved Africa into spheres of influence. Borders were drawn on paper, treaties signed in distant capitals, and maps filled with imperial claims. Yet the reality on the ground demanded far more than ink and signatures. Authority had to be enforced. Rivers, forests, and plains were still controlled by African polities, armed communities, and resilient networks. To assert dominion, the empire turned to force. Guns, soldiers, and coercion became the instruments of power. Profit and ambition demanded violence, and violence became the lifeblood of empire. The Ashanti Kingdom, in modern Ghana, epitomized the challenge. The Ashanti had long been a sophisticated state, with centralized governance, military organization, and deep knowledge of the terrain. European traders, then administrators, could not simply impose authority. British forces launched campaigns in 1873 and again in 1896, seeking to dismantle the kingdom's autonomy. Forts were constructed, roads cut into the forests, and artillery deployed. Yet even with modern weaponry, resistance was fierce. The Ashanti used guerrilla tactics, ambushing columns, controlling river crossings, and exploiting their intimate knowledge of the terrain. The British would eventually prevail, but only at enormous cost in lives and resources. The war illustrated the stark reality. Imperial claims required persistent and often brutal enforcement. Southwards, the Zulu kingdom presented a similar challenge. Shaka's successors had maintained strong military traditions and mobilized communities capable of organized defense. British forces, bolstered by the industrial capacity of empire, brought the newly invented Maxim gun into battle. The machine gun transformed warfare, creating a decisive, though horrific, advantage. In engagements like the Battle of Ulundi in 1879, traditional formations were obliterated in minutes. Tens of thousands of warriors fell, while European casualties remained comparatively low. Technological supremacy had turned the dynamics of conflict. Guns became instruments not just of defense, but of systematic conquest, reshaping the possibilities of empire. Meanwhile, in the Sudan, the modest resistance demonstrated the limits of conventional European military methods. Muhammad Ahmed, the self-declared Mahdi, united diverse groups against Egyptian and British control along the Nile. In 1885, the fall of Khartoum and the death of General Gordon shocked London. The campaign illustrated that local leadership, ideology, and terrain could still challenge industrialized powers. Yet the British adapted. Larger expeditions, new logistics, and modern weaponry eventually subdued the modest state. By 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, once again, the pattern was clear. Conquest demanded persistence, firepower, and unrelenting pressure. Corporate empires became central to the enforcement of imperial authority. Chartered companies, blending private profit with state sanction, acted as armies, administrators, and expectors. The British South Africa Company, led by figures like Cecil Rhodes, controlled vast swaths of southern Africa. Its agents raised militias, constructed forts, and regulated local labor. Policies of land, seizure, taxation, and racial hierarchy were enforced with both persuasion and brutality. The distinction between economic and political authority blurred. Profit and governance were inseparable. Profit demanded control, and control demanded coercion. Land seizure became a standard tool of empire. European settlers, corporate agents, and administrators displaced local communities, reconfiguring territories to suit European priorities. Indigenous laws, landholding patterns, and political authority were ignored or dismantled. Racial hierarchies were codified, restricting mobility, labor, and rights. African populations were subordinated legally, socially, and economically. Violence was both a threat and a practice. Those who resisted faced summary execution, imprisonment, or forced labor. Empire enforced itself through a combination of guns, bureaucratic authority, and institutionalized coercion. The Boer War, 1899–1902, in South Africa, further illustrates the empire's ruthless pragmatism. British forces confronted the Boer republics, whose commandos utilized mobility, knowledge of the veldt, and guerrilla tactics to great effect. In response, the British instituted a system of concentration camps, detaining civilians, women, children, and the elderly to deprive Boer fighters of support. Mortality in the camps was high, fueled by disease, malnutrition, and inadequate resources. The war revealed that profit, security, and control often outweighed restraint, morality, or public conscience. The machinery of empire could operate with brutal efficiency. Maxim guns, railways, and steamships transformed the scale and lethality of imperial campaigns. European forces could now deploy over long distances, sustain campaigns in hostile terrain, and project power rapidly. The combination of technology and logistics created an asymmetry in warfare. African resistance remained formidable, but industrialized weaponry and coordinated military strategy increasingly determined outcomes. Empire was no longer constrained by local geography. Guns and infrastructure remade the battlefield in favor of European powers. Corporate militaries were not incidental. They were integral. Chartered companies combined commercial motives with coercive capacity. Their agents levied taxes, enforced labor, and raised armed forces. In regions like modern Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, companies controlled trade, movement, and local administration. Violence was routine. Punitive expeditions suppressed revolts. Laborers were disciplined, and communities were reorganized to serve corporate interests. The logic was consistent. Profit required authority, authority required enforcement, and enforcement required guns. The interplay between state and company blurred. Governments relied on chartered enterprises to extend control cheaply and efficiently. Companies absorbed risk, enforced labor, and extracted resources, while states provided recognition, legitimacy, and occasional military support. This hybrid model allowed the empire to govern vast territories with limited personnel, while maintaining authority over hostile or uncooperative populations. The result was systematic, institutionalized coercion, embedded in economic and military structures. Cecil Rhodes exemplified the convergence of corporate ambition and imperial enforcement. Through negotiation, coercion, and military expeditions, he expanded British influence across southern Africa. The British South Africa Company, under his leadership, orchestrated campaigns against the Ndebele and Shona, seizing land, enforcing labor policies, and consolidating control. The pursuit of mineral wealth, gold and diamonds was inseparable from military campaigns, administration, and racial hierarchy. Profit dictated strategy, guns enforced it. The consequences of conquest wars were profound. African societies were disrupted, displaced, and transformed. Political systems were dismantled or subordinated to imperial authority. Economies were redirected toward European markets. Labor obligations, taxation, and military conscription imposed new pressures on communities. Mortality from conflict, disease, and forced labor remained high. Violence became normalized as a tool of governance. An empire demonstrated that profit and power often erased restraint. Resistance never ceased. African leaders, communities, and warriors continually sought to challenge imperial authority. Guerrilla campaigns, rebellions, and strategic negotiations slowed occupation, imposed costs, and forced adaptation. Yet the combination of industrial weaponry, corporate armies, and coordinated strategy made sustained success for resistance increasingly difficult. Empire, once constrained by local knowledge and terrain, now leveraged technology and organization to enforce compliance. Racial laws formalized inequality. Land allocation, labor obligations, and civil rights were codified to privilege European settlers and administrators. Indigenous populations were relegated to subordinate positions, restricted in mobility, property rights, and political influence. These policies reinforced the economic and military control established through conquest, ensuring that authority was maintained even in the absence of active conflict. Violence was institutionalized, both overt and structural. The Ashanti Zulu and Sudan campaigns illustrate a broader pattern. Empire demanded adaptation, persistence, and lethality. Each conflict revealed the interplay between local knowledge, military technology, and imperial strategy. European forces relied on logistics, rivers, and railways to project power. African resistance relied on terrain, mobility, and social cohesion. The outcome consistently favored the empire, but only through sustained investment, planning, and brutality. Guns were both symbols and instruments of authority. Chartered companies extended this model across the continent. The combination of commercial incentive and military capacity ensured that vast territories could be exploited efficiently. Forts, patrols, and administrative posts consolidated control, while labor obligations and taxation extracted value. Violence was embedded in daily operations. Punitive expeditions, forced labor, and execution enforced compliance. The logic was relentless. Control enabled profit. Profit justified coercion, and coercion ensured control. Infrastructure amplified imperial power. Railways, roads, and ports connected resource-rich interior regions to coastal markets. African laborers were mobilized to construct these networks under strict supervision, often enduring harsh conditions and high mortality. Steamships and guns projected power along rivers, enabling rapid response to resistance or rebellion. The empire's reach was not abstract. It was tangible, enforced, and lethal. The Boer War underscores the extremes of imperial pragmatism, detaining civilians in concentration camps, implementing scorched earth tactics, and deploying superior weaponry revealed the empire's willingness to subordinate ethics to control. The war was a lesson in the fusion of military technology, logistics, and coercive policy. Resistance could be suppressed, but only at the cost of widespread suffering. Empire, in practice, was an exercise in power backed by guns and unrelenting organization. By the close of the 19th century, the pattern was clear. Conquest wars and corporate empires operated hand in hand. Military technology, economic incentive, and administrative capacity converged to enforce European authority. African resistance was persistent but increasingly constrained. Violence was routine, systematic, and justified as necessary for order, profit, and civilization. Profit and power erased restraint. Empire relied on both discipline and brutality to achieve its aims. The human cost was immense. Communities were displaced, laborers subjected to coercion, and societies transformed under foreign rule. Traditional governance was subordinated, and indigenous knowledge was exploited or ignored. Racial hierarchies and legal structures formalized inequality. Industrial technology, guns, and corporate organization ensured that the empire could extract wealth efficiently while imposing authority over millions. Profit, prestige, and strategic advantage were inseparable from coercion. Conquest wars illustrate a fundamental truth about imperial expansion. Authority is not abstract. It is enforced, maintained, and continuously challenged. Guns, logistics, and corporate armies were essential. Profit-motivated action. Military technology enabled it. Coercion shaped governance. Violence codified compliance. The machinery of empire state, company, military functioned as an integrated system designed to extract wealth, control populations, and suppress resistance. By 1900, Africa was largely under European control. Ashanti, Zulu, and Sudanese resistance had been subdued or incorporated. Chartered companies administered vast territories, railways, forts, and administrative posts enforced authority. Indigenous political and social systems had been reconfigured. Empire had been secured through coordinated violence, technological advantage, and strategic investment. Guns, profit, and ambition had reshaped the continent. The pattern established in these conquest wars would persist into the 20th century. Economic exploitation, racial hierarchy, and administrative control would remain central. The methods developed corporate armies, chartered companies, technological supremacy, and coercive labor systems would be replicated across colonies. Profit and power dictated policy. Restraint was secondary. Empire was industrialized, militarized, and systematic. Profit and power erased restraint. By the early 20th century, the conquest wars had subsided. Guns, companies, and expeditions had established European dominance over most of Africa. Yet victory on the battlefield was only the first challenge. The continent was vast, its population diverse, and European administrators were few. Governing millions across thousands of miles of rivers, forests, deserts, and mountains required innovation. Empire could not rely on direct oversight. It had to govern at a distance, with economy, efficiency, and coercion as its primary tools. The principle of indirect rule became central. Instead of replacing African authority entirely, colonial powers co-opted local leaders, chiefs, elders, and kings to administer day-to-day governance. European administrators set broad policy, taxation, labor quotas, trade regulations, and legal codes. Local authorities enforced them. The system allowed imperial governments to exercise control without large bureaucracies. Few Europeans could monitor vast territories. Authority was multiplied through intermediaries. But this control came with constraints. Indirect rule depended on compliance from both the local officials and the communities they governed. The empire was powerful, yet fragile. Taxes became a cornerstone of this governance. Colonial administrations imposed head taxes, hut taxes, and labor levies. These payments forced communities into the cash economy, often requiring men to work on plantations, mines, or public projects to earn money. Taxes were not neutral instruments, they were coercive tools, extracting labor under the guise of fiscal responsibility. Those who could not pay faced fines, imprisonment, or confiscation of land and property. In essence, taxes transformed daily survival into a mechanism of imperial control. Every coin collected reinforced authority. Every default justified coercion. Infrastructure supported this system. Railways, roads, and ports were constructed to connect resource-rich interior regions to coastal export points. Labor for these projects was extracted from local populations, often forcibly. Europeans supervised construction, but the bulk of the work was carried out by Africans. Railways enabled rapid troop movement, ensured resource flows, and provided the logistical backbone of empire. They made paper borders enforceable. Territory could be controlled, labor mobilized, and resources extracted efficiently. Geography, once a constraint, was transformed into an instrument of authority. Legal systems codified inequality. Colonial governments imposed racial hierarchies, restricting rights, property ownership, and political participation. Indigenous populations were subject to separate legal regimes, often presided over by European administrators or compliant local officials. Criminal codes, land laws, and labor regulations institutionalized subordination. Resistance was criminalized. Disobedience, rebellion, or even cultural practices could be punished with imprisonment, fines, or corporal measures. Empire ran on law, but the law was coercive. Consent was secondary. Compliance was enforced. Resistance never ceased, though it changed form. Guerrilla warfare, strikes, and subtle forms of defiance persisted throughout colonies. Communities manipulated tax collection, refused labor obligations, or challenged appointed chiefs. Missionaries, local intermediaries, and European officials worked to suppress dissent through surveillance, intelligence networks, and punitive expeditions. The result was a system of control maintained through constant vigilance. Empire relied not on legitimacy but on capacity for swift coercion. Indirect rule also created contradictions. European authorities relied on local chiefs to enforce policies, but these leaders often retained loyalty to their communities. Chiefs could resist, subvert, or manipulate colonial mandates for personal advantage. Administrators navigated a delicate balance, empowering local structures enough to govern cheaply, yet restraining them to prevent challenges to European authority. The empire's efficiency depended on intermediaries, but intermediaries were neither entirely reliable nor entirely loyal. Governance was a negotiation enforced through threat and occasional violence. The suppression of dissent extended into labor practices. Plantation systems, mines, and extraction projects demanded steady workforces. Europeans often imposed quotas, enforced through local officials or company militia. Punitive measures were routine: fines, beatings, imprisonment, or forced conscription. The logic was simple: labor was essential to revenue, infrastructure, and extraction. Coercion was not incidental, it was structural. The empire functioned because it could extract human effort efficiently and brutally. Racial hierarchies underpinned all aspects of governance. Segregation, differential taxation, and restricted legal rights codified subordination. European settlers, administrators, and commercial agents occupied privileged positions, while indigenous populations were systematically disadvantaged. Education, property, and political representation were tightly controlled. Inequality was enforced legally, socially, and economically. Authority rested on structured subordination as much as on force of arms. Colonial administrations were small but effective. A handful of Europeans could supervise thousands of African subjects through a network of chiefs, clerks, and intermediaries. Reports, censuses, and surveillance allowed distant offices to monitor compliance. Discipline was enforced by local officials, police forces, and small military detachments. The combination of indirect rule, taxation, infrastructure, and law created a system where vast populations could be governed with minimal personnel, yet maintained under persistent control. Rebellions, when they occurred, were swiftly and ruthlessly suppressed. Insurgencies in the Gold Coast, East Africa, and Southern Africa demonstrated both local resistance and European resolve. Punitive expeditions destroyed villages, executed leaders, and confiscated land. Rebellion was not tolerated. The consequences were immediate and severe. Empire functioned through deterrence, exemplifying the principle that coercion, not consent, maintained authority. Missionaries continued to support governance. Schools, churches, and health programs fostered literacy and compliance. Educated Africans often served as clerks, intermediaries, or teachers, reinforcing the authority of chiefs and colonial administrators. Religious and educational interventions helped shape societal norms, aligning them with European objectives. Authority was extended not only through coercion but also through cultural and social structures. Knowledge and ideology became instruments of control alongside law and guns. Railways facilitated the integration of economic and administrative control. Interior regions, once remote and autonomous, became accessible to inspectors, tax collectors, and troops. Resources: timber, minerals, and agricultural products were transported to coastal ports. Labor was mobilized efficiently, and surveillance became feasible. Geography was no longer a barrier but a conduit. Empire expanded through connection, creating a networked system of coercion that penetrated deep into the continent. Colonial legal systems reinforced this network. Courts adjudicated disputes under European law, often disregarding indigenous legal practices. Local chiefs administered lower courts, but their authority was circumscribed. Disobedience was criminalized. Property, labor, and movement were regulated. Legal structures institutionalized inequality, making compliance a matter of law as well as coercion. Empire ran efficiently because authority was embedded in systems, not just enforced in the field. The cumulative effect was a continent governed cheaply, yet ruthlessly. Millions were brought under control, with minimal European personnel. Authority was maintained through coercion, infrastructure, taxation, and legal codes. Resistance was suppressed, monitored, and constrained. Profit, extraction, and administration were intertwined. Empire did not rely on legitimacy or consent, it relied on the capacity to enforce, extract, and dominate systematically. African agency persisted. Though constrained, communities adapted, negotiated, and sometimes evaded control. Chiefs manipulated policies to preserve local advantage. Laborers resisted quotas, fled plantations, or sabotaged infrastructure. Surveillance and punitive systems limited these actions, but agency never disappeared entirely. Empire depended on constant negotiation between coercion and compliance, threat and obedience. Control was maintained by capacity, not consent. By the 1920s, colonial administration had refined these systems. Indirect rule, taxation, legal codes, railways, and police forces allowed European powers to govern vast territories efficiently. African societies were reshaped to facilitate extraction, surveillance, and compliance. Governance operated on multiple levels. European officials set policy, intermediaries enforced it, and communities adapted or resisted. Violence, law, and infrastructure combined to maintain authority. Colonial rule demonstrates a fundamental principle of empire. Authority is scalable through coercion, not democracy. A handful of administrators could manage millions by leveraging intermediaries, legal structures, and infrastructure. Profit, extraction, and governance were inseparable. Compliance was enforced through a mixture of coercion, threat, and limited incentive. Consent was incidental. Control was operational. Infrastructure, law, and taxation intertwined with social control. Chiefs became agents of the state, laborers became instruments of production, and communities were constrained by legal and economic pressures. European power extended through networks, not sheer numbers. Empire functioned because it could orchestrate complex systems remotely, applying force selectively and efficiently. Violence was embedded in administration, not confined to the battlefield. The patterns established under colonial rule would endure for decades. Governance without numbers allowed the empire to extract wealth, maintain authority, and suppress dissent across the continent. Legal racial hierarchies institutionalized inequality. Labor systems ensured economic production. Railways, roads, and ports enabled both extraction and control. Resistance was managed, subdued, or co-opted. Empire operated systematically, relying on coercion rather than consent. By the mid-20th century, the consequences were evident. African societies had been reorganized, economies reshaped, and political authority transformed. Indigenous leadership persisted but subordinated to colonial frameworks. Labor, taxation, and legal systems bound communities into the imperial project. The machinery of empire had become efficient, far-reaching, and coercive. Authority had been scaled without proportional personnel. Yet compliance remained fragile, maintained through constant enforcement. Colonial rule required vigilance, adaptability, and coordination. Threats of rebellion, evasion, or negotiation demanded responsive administration. Infrastructure, law, and coercion functioned together to sustain authority. Empire had become a system, a network of power, reliant on the ability to enforce rather than the consent of the governed. Coercion, backed by organization and threat, was the foundation of control. Empire runs on coercion, not consent. The outbreak of global conflict in 1914 reached far beyond European borders. The First World War demanded unprecedented manpower, resources, and logistics. Africa, still largely under colonial domination, became a crucial reservoir for men, materials, and labor. Millions of Africans were recruited or compelled into campaigns across the continent, Europe, and the Middle East. They fought, carried supplies, and built infrastructure. Their labor and lives consumed to sustain empires whose promises of protection and justice rarely extended to them. Empire had demanded obedience, and now it demanded sacrifice. Colonial authorities relied heavily on forced recruitment. Men were conscripted into armies, militias, and labor corps. In West Africa, French and British recruiters scoured villages, selecting able-bodied men for transport to the front lines or to carry supplies. Compliance was enforced through taxation, threats, or physical coercion. Many had no choice. Those who resisted faced imprisonment, fines, or summary execution. Recruitment was not voluntary. It was an extension of the coercive structures established under colonial rule. Empire demanded bodies, and it claimed them efficiently. Once enlisted, African soldiers were subjected to harsh conditions. Those serving in combat roles faced modern industrial warfare, machine guns, artillery, and chemical weapons. Those in support roles, carrier corps, porters, and labor battalions endured grueling marches, exposure to disease, and minimal rations. Thousands perished from exhaustion, malnutrition, or tropical illnesses exacerbated by long campaigns. For many, survival depended on endurance rather than skill. The empire relied on their labor and their courage, yet it rarely acknowledged their sacrifice. Africans were both essential and invisible. The war exposed African soldiers to new ideas and experiences. They traveled to Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, witnessing technological development, political structures, and social organization previously unknown to them. Letters home carried stories of industrial cities, organized armies, and strange customs. Contact with European societies, albeit segregated, limited, and discriminatory, planted seeds of awareness. Soldiers began to recognize the contradictions in empire, the promises of civilization and protection versus the reality of exploitation and inequality. Experience became knowledge, and knowledge became a subtle form of empowerment. For many Africans, the war carried the weight of broken promises. Colonial authorities had implied that service would bring rewards, improve status, citizenship, or recognition. Instead, most were returned to the same conditions of subordination, taxation, and labor obligations as before. Veterans found their sacrifices undervalued, their communities uncompensated, and their political voice suppressed. Disillusionment spread. Service in European wars had exacted immense human cost, but it did not translate into meaningful autonomy or equality. Empire had demanded obedience and payment, yet it offered little in return. The war also reshaped social and political consciousness. Returning soldiers shared experiences, knowledge, and stories of foreign lands, planting the seeds of political awareness and community organization. Exposure to European propaganda, ideologies of self-determination, and nationalist discourse highlighted the contradictions of colonial authority. Across the continent, small but growing movements began to question imperial legitimacy. Service in the world's wars had not created loyalty, it had created expectation, disappointment, and a determination to seek justice. In addition to manpower, African colonies contributed resources and infrastructure. Railways, ports, and roads, originally built to enforce colonial authority and extract wealth, were now repurposed to support the war effort. Mines produced metals and minerals essential to artillery, vehicles, and machinery. Plantations supplied food for troops at the front. The colonial economy, tightly integrated into global markets, was mobilized in totality. Africans bore the burden. Labor, land, and harvests were redirected from local needs to global imperial priorities. The Second World War repeated and amplified these patterns. Mobilization was broader, more systematic, and technologically advanced. Millions of Africans were conscripted, this time with greater coordination and global reach. They served in North Africa, Burma, the Middle East, and Europe. Carrier corps carried supplies across deserts, jungles, and mountains. Soldiers faced mechanized warfare and aerial bombardment. Disease, exhaustion, and hunger remained constant threats. The human cost was staggering, yet colonial powers relied on this labor as essential to global strategy. Empire demanded sacrifice, often without recognition. Participation in the wars accelerated the spread of new ideas. Africans encountered anti-fascist and anti-imperialist ideologies, participated in political discussions, and witnessed global conflicts in which European powers themselves were challenged. Education, literacy, and military training exposed individuals to leadership skills and organizational strategies previously unavailable under strict colonial hierarchies. Soldiers, laborers, and veterans returned home with networks, knowledge, and perspectives that would soon inform nationalist movements. War had opened minds even as it exacted bodies. Despite the enormous contributions, colonial authorities maintained strict control. Promises of political reform or autonomy were postponed or denied. African veterans were often marginalized, excluded from decision-making, or ignored in the post-war settlement. The disparity between service and reward created widespread dissatisfaction. Nationalist sentiments grew, fueled by experience, observation, and exposure. Service in Europe and the Middle East had made empire's fragility evident. Europeans relied on African labor and sacrifice, yet refused to grant rights or recognition in return. Empire, observers realized, was not invincible. Carrier corps and labor battalions were often the backbone of military operations. Across East Africa, thousands of men carried supplies for months at a time, navigating jungles, rivers, and deserts. Death rates were high, sometimes exceeding 20%. Disease, exhaustion, and inadequate provisions claimed more lives than enemy action. Yet these corps were indispensable. Supply lines depended on African labor. Without them, European armies could not operate effectively. The wars revealed the indispensability of African contribution, even as colonial powers minimized acknowledgement. The wars also laid bare the limits of imperial power. Resistance, desertion, and negotiation revealed cracks in authority. Local populations sometimes exploited recruitment drives, labor demands, and resource requisitions to assert influence, negotiate terms, or evade obligations. Disease and terrain limited the mobility of European troops. Logistics strained supply lines. European officers often relied on African knowledge of local conditions. Empire's strength was contingent, dependent on cooperation, adaptation, and human labor. The illusion of omnipotence faded. Nationalism began to emerge as a direct consequence of wartime experience. Soldiers and laborers returned with a sense of shared purpose, organization, and rights consciousness. Local political associations formed initially to advocate for veterans' rights, labor reforms, and education. These movements evolved into broader anti-colonial and nationalist campaigns. African experience in global wars had introduced the tools of modern political mobilization, communication networks, leadership structures, and strategic planning. Empire had inadvertently trained the architects of its future challenges. By the 1940s, the impact of African participation in global conflicts was clear. The wars had mobilized millions, exposed vulnerabilities, and challenged the assumption that European power was absolute. Africans had demonstrated resilience, skill, and indispensability. Yet colonial authorities remained intent on maintaining control, delaying reform, and exploiting labor. The gap between contribution and recognition fueled discontent. Empire's dependence on African resources and labor had become visible to Africans themselves, undermining colonial legitimacy. Education and exposure to new ideas accelerated change. Mission schools, literacy programs, and interactions with European soldiers exposed Africans to political concepts, civil rights discourse, and organizational strategies. These encounters, combined with wartime service, created a generation aware of global inequalities and contradictions. Expectations for autonomy, rights, and self-determination were no longer abstract, they were informed by lived experience. War had been both teacher and revealer. The wars exposed the fragility of imperial authority. European powers could claim territory, deploy military technology, and coerce populations. Yet they relied heavily on African labor, local knowledge, and cooperation. Desertion, resistance, and negotiation highlighted vulnerabilities. Disease, logistics, and terrain imposed constraints. Empire was powerful but dependent, and Africans had learned where the cracks lay. This knowledge would prove decisive in the decades to come. Broken promises fueled political consciousness. Veterans who had survived the battlefield returned home to find taxation, forced labor, and social subordination unchanged. Communities that had contributed resources faced continued exploitation. The dissonance between sacrifice and reward was striking. It became a focal point for emerging nationalist sentiment, a justification for questioning colonial authority, and a catalyst for organized resistance. Empire had demanded loyalty and bodies. It had provided little in return. The First and Second World Wars fundamentally reshaped Africa's relationship with Europe. Exposure, labor, sacrifice, and experience created a continent increasingly aware of the limits of colonial power. Nationalist movements began to coalesce, first in urban centers, later in rural areas. Using the networks, strategies, and political awareness forged in wartime, the wars had trained a generation not just to fight but to organize, advocate, and challenge authority. Empire's dependence on African labor had revealed its vulnerability. By the mid-20th century, the lesson was clear. Africa had been essential to European conflict, yet its people remained subordinated. Africans had fought, carried, and built infrastructure for empires that refused recognition or autonomy. Yet these same experiences nurtured the rise of nationalism, political organization, and awareness of imperial weakness. The contradiction between contribution and subjugation could not endure. War had taught Africa lessons about power, exploitation, and possibility. Empire's foundation, once presumed unassailable, had cracks, and Africans now understood how to exploit them. World wars exposed empire's dependence, revealed its moral and logistical contradictions, and sowed the seeds of political awakening. Millions had fought and labored, endured hardship, and witnessed the contradictions of European rule. They returned home, changed, informed, and impatient with subordination. The mechanisms of coercion, taxation, and indirect rule could not erase experience. The stage was set for the century-long struggle for independence, informed by sacrifice and sharpened by knowledge. War teaches empire's weakness. The borders drawn by European powers still shape conflicts today. Rivers, mountains, and arbitrary lines on maps became instruments of authority, and they remain flashpoints long after the flags changed. Economies built on extraction continue to prioritize foreign markets over local needs, carrying the echoes of centuries-old systems of control. Britain did not simply lose Africa. It reshaped its influence. Its structures and its hierarchies lingered, quietly embedded in law, trade, and society. Empire ended on paper, but in reality, it left a foundation that is difficult to undo. Britain's story in Africa did not begin with conquest, and it did not end with independence. It evolved into something quieter, something pervasive, something that cannot be erased. Power, profit, and coercion transformed from visible occupation into invisible influence. What was once enforced with guns and chartered companies now survives in institutions, economies, and politics. The legacy is complex, sometimes hidden, but always present. If you followed this journey with me from the first voyages across the Atlantic to the last struggles for sovereignty, you've seen not just a story of conquest, but of endurance, adaptation, and consequence. History is rarely tidy, and its effects are rarely gone. If you found this exploration meaningful, I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel so we can continue uncovering these hidden layers together. Your support helps me bring these stories to life, and trust me, the past has more to tell than most of us realize. Past picture, overlay montage of historical maps, old photographs of African soldiers in the World Wars, colonial railways, and archival images of markets and ports. Britain's story in Africa didn't begin with conquest, and it didn't end with independence. It became something quieter and harder to undo.